The day Lydia Bennett was rejected at the train station for being too quiet, she never imagined that her silence would become the very thing that would lead her to true love. In the harsh winter of 1885, a mail-order bride stood frozen on a Montana platform as her promised groom sneered at her damaged voice and walked away, leaving her stranded 2,000 miles from home. But sometimes, the cruelest rejections lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Stay with me as I share this incredible story of how one woman's silence spoke louder than words ever could. And please, comment below which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The train's whistle cut through the Montana morning like a blade through silk, its echo bouncing off the snow-capped mountains that surrounded Willow Creek. Steam billowed from the locomotive's stack, creating ghostly patterns against the February sky as passengers began their descent onto the wooden platform. Among them, a young woman in a worn navy dress clutched a leather satchel to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. Lydia Bennett had traveled for 6 days to reach this moment. 6 days of watching the landscape transform from the familiar streets of Philadelphia to the wild, untamed territories of the West. 6 days of rehearsing what she would say to Charles Morton, the man who had promised her a new life through a series of carefully penned letters. 6 days of hope building in her chest like a bird preparing for flight. She stepped carefully onto the platform, her boots making soft sounds against the frost-covered wood. The cold hit her immediately. Not the damp, clinging cold of eastern winters, but something sharper, cleaner, more honest in its brutality. She pulled her thin coat tighter, scanning the crowd of rough-faced men and curious townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrival of the weekly train. "You must be Miss Bennett," a voice called out, and Lydia turned to see a man approaching. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back with pomade and a mustache waxed to precise points. Charles Morton looked exactly as he had described himself in his letters. Handsome in a calculated way, dressed in a fine wool suit that seemed almost ostentatious among the practical clothing of the other ranchers and merchants. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs as she nodded, reaching into her satchel for the small slate and piece of chalk she always carried. But before she could retrieve them, Charles grabbed her hand, his grip firm and possessive. "Well then," he said loudly, clearly performing for the gathered crowd, "let's hear that sweet voice of yours. You wrote such beautiful letters, surely you can manage a proper greeting for your husband-to-be." The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity palpable in the morning air. Lydia felt her throat constrict, the familiar panic rising as she tried to force sound past her damaged vocal cords. She had explained in her letters. Hadn't she made it clear? The childhood fever that had nearly killed her at age 7 had left her voice a broken whisper, barely audible even in perfect silence. The sound that emerged was less than a whisper, more like the rustling of dry leaves. She tried again, straining until her throat burned. "I am pleased." The words died before they could fully form, swallowed by the ambient noise of the platform, the hissing steam, the murmur of onlookers, the distant lowing of cattle. Charles's expression shifted from expectation to confusion, then to something darker. "Speak up, woman," he commanded, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present moments before. "These good people came to meet my bride. The least you can do is greet them properly." Lydia's hand shook as she finally managed to pull out her slate. She wrote quickly, her chalk scratching against the dark surface. "I explained in my letters. My voice was damaged by fever. I can barely speak above a whisper." Charles snatched the slate from her hands, read it, and his face contorted with rage. "You said you had a quiet voice," he snarled. "You didn't say you were practically mute." The word hit Lydia like a physical blow. Mute. She wasn't mute. She could speak. Just not loudly enough for this world that demanded women be seen and not heard, except when commanded to perform like trained birds. "This is fraud," Charles declared, turning to address the crowd as if he were a prosecutor presenting evidence. "This woman deceived me. Made me believe I was getting a proper wife, not some—" He gestured dismissively at Lydia. "Defective creature who can't even greet a man properly." "Now hold on, Morton," an older man in the crowd spoke up. It was Sheriff Theodore Hawkins, his weathered face creased with concern. "The lady's come a long way. Surely you can—" "I can what?" Charles interrupted. Accept damaged goods? I advertise for a wife, not a burden. How's she supposed to call for help if there's trouble at the ranch? How's she going to teach our children to speak? How can she sing hymns in church or gossip with the other wives? He shook his head theatrically. No, this won't do at all. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, tossing them at Lydia's feet. There. That should cover your return fare. Go back to wherever you came from and find some other fool to trick. The money scattered in the wind, some bills catching on the wet platform, others floating away like dying butterflies. Lydia stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Around her, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, some sympathetic, others cruel. Poor thing, one woman whispered. Morton's right, though, a man replied. What use is a woman who can't even holler for her husband at supper time? Bet she thought she'd trap him, another voice added. These Eastern women, always scheming. Lydia's legs trembled, but she forced herself to remain standing. She would not collapse here, not in front of these people, not in front of him. With movements that felt disconnected from her body, she bent to collect the scattered bills, her fingers numb with cold and humiliation. That's right, Charles said with satisfaction. The next train east comes through in 3 days. I suggest you be on it. He turned and strode away, his boots clicking against the platform with the confidence of a man who had never been rejected, never been found wanting, never been told he wasn't enough. The crowd began to disperse. Their entertainment concluded, leaving Lydia alone except for a few stragglers who watched her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Miss? A gentle voice broke through her haze of shock. Lydia looked up to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. I'm Martha Calloway. I run the boarding house on 2nd Street. You look like you could use a warm place to rest and think things through. Lydia wanted to respond, wanted to thank this stranger for her kindness, but her throat had closed completely now, not from physical damage, but from the weight of her shame. She nodded instead, gathering her satchel and following Martha away from the platform that had become the site of her public humiliation. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days, its yellow paint peeling in places and its shutters hanging slightly askew. But smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney, and the windows glowed with warm lamplight despite the morning hour. Martha led her inside, past a small parlor where 2 elderly men played checkers, and up a narrow staircase to a room at the end of the hall. This one's empty, Martha said, opening the door to reveal a small but clean room with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the snow-covered mountains. The rate is $2 a week, including breakfast and supper. Can you manage that? Lydia counted the bills she had collected from the platform. Charles had thrown $15 at her, enough for a train ticket back east, or enough to survive here for a few weeks if she was careful. She held out $2 to Martha, who took them with a nod. Supper's at 6, Martha said. And Miss Bennet? Don't let Charles Morton's cruelty define your worth. That man wouldn't recognize value if it came with a bank certificate attached. After Martha left, Lydia sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Silent sobs shook her body. Even her grief was voiceless. She had sold everything she owned to make this journey, had left behind the small life she had carved out for herself in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress's assistant. She had believed Charles's letters, his promises of a simple but good life, of acceptance and partnership. She pulled the letters from her satchel, reading through them with new eyes. How had she missed the signs? The way he focused on her descriptions of her housekeeping skills, her needlework, her ability to stretch a dollar. He had wanted a servant he could also bed, not a partner. And when she had mentioned her voice, describing it as quiet and soft, he had probably imagined some demure, whispering beauty, not a woman whose vocal cords had been scarred by scarlet fever. The morning passed in a blur of tears and self-recrimination. By afternoon, hunger drove Lydia from her room. She descended the stairs quietly, hoping to avoid interaction, but Martha intercepted her in the hallway. There you are, the older woman said briskly. I've been thinking. My friend Emma runs the seamstress shop on Main Street. She's been complaining about needing help. Can you sew? Lydia nodded eagerly, pulling out her slate to write, Yes, I'm quite skilled. I worked for a dressmaker in Philadelphia. Martha read the message and smiled. Good. Clean yourself up and I'll walk you over there. Emma's a bit particular, but she's fair, and she won't care a whit about your voice if your stitches are straight. An hour later, Lydia found herself in a shop that smelled of cotton and lavender, surrounded by bolts of fabric and half-finished garments. Emma Hartley was a thin, bird-like woman with sharp eyes and fingers that moved like lightning across whatever fabric she touched. "Martha says you can sew," Emma said without preamble. "Show me." She handed Lydia a piece of torn silk, a challenging fabric that would reveal any clumsiness or lack of skill. Lydia examined the tear, selected a needle and thread that matched perfectly, and began to work. Her stitches were tiny and precise, nearly invisible against the delicate fabric. When she finished, Emma held the repaired section up to the light, searching for flaws. "Well," Emma said finally, "you'll do. I can pay $3 a week plus commission on any special orders you complete. You'll work Monday through Saturday, 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with an hour for lunch. Acceptable?" Lydia nodded, relief flooding through her. She wouldn't have to return east in defeat. She could survive here, at least for a while. The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Lydia woke early, took breakfast in Martha's dining room, where she learned to ignore the curious stares and whispered speculations of other boarders, then walked the 3 blocks to Emma's shop. She worked in the back room mostly, invisible to customers but surrounded by beautiful fabrics and the satisfying challenge of transforming them into garments. Emma quickly learned to appreciate her silent employee. Lydia never gossiped, never complained, and never disturbed the customers with chatter. Her work was impeccable, and she had a talent for understanding exactly what a customer wanted even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. She would sketch designs on her slate, making adjustments based on their reactions until their faces lit up with recognition. Word of Charles Morton's rejection had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, and Lydia knew she was the subject of much discussion. Some viewed her with pity, others with suspicion, and still others with the kind of morbid curiosity reserved for circus oddities. She kept her head high and her interactions minimal, communicating through her slate when necessary and avoiding social situations whenever possible. It was on a particularly cold Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after her arrival, that the bell above the shop door chimed and a man entered. Lydia looked up from the hem she was adjusting to see a figure that seemed to fill the doorway, not just with his physical presence, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but with a kind of quiet intensity that made the air in the room shift. He had the weathered look of a man who spent his days under the sun and sky, with premature lines around eyes the color of storm clouds. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at his collar, and his clothes, while clean, showed the wear of hard use. He carried a shirt in his large, calloused hands, and he moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to navigating spaces not built for his size. "Emma?" he called out, his voice different somehow, the pitch and rhythm unlike the typical patterns of speech Lydia had grown accustomed to hearing. Emma emerged from behind the counter, her face breaking into a genuine smile, a rare occurrence. But instead of speaking, she began moving her hands in fluid, deliberate patterns. The man responded in kind, his hands dancing through the air in what Lydia recognized as sign language. She watched, transfixed, as an entire conversation took place in perfect silence. The man, Emma signed his name as Elias Gray, had torn his shirt on barbed wire and needed it repaired. Emma's hands indicated that she was too busy with Mrs. Morrison's wedding dress, but that her assistant could handle it. Emma turned to Lydia and spoke aloud. "Lydia, can you repair Mr. Gray's shirt? He needs it by tomorrow if possible." Lydia nodded, rising from her workstation. As she approached, Elias Gray turned to face her fully, and she saw something flicker in his expression, not pity or curiosity, but a kind of recognition. He handed her the shirt, a well-made flannel torn badly across the shoulder. She examined the damage, then reached for her slate to write an estimate and timeline. But as she lifted the chalk, Elias gently touched her wrist, stopping her. Moving slowly and deliberately, he pointed to himself, then to his ears, shaking his head. Then he began to fingerspell, each letter formed carefully, D-E-A-F. Lydia's breath caught. She pointed to herself, then to her throat, and shook her head slightly. Then, trembling slightly, she attempted to fingerspell back, Q-U-I-E-T. A smile broke across Elias's face. Not mocking or condescending, but warm and somehow delighted. He signed something rapid to Emma, who laughed. "He says it's nice to meet someone else who speaks the language of silence," Emma translated. Then to Lydia's surprise, she added, "Elias is my cousin. He's been deaf since a childhood illness, runs a ranch about 5 miles north of town." Elias signed again, and Emma continued translating. "He wants to know if you know any sign language." Lydia shook her head, then wrote on her slate, "Only letters. I learned from a book to teach a deaf student in Philadelphia." When Emma relayed this, Elias's eyes lit up with interest. He signed something else, and Emma said, "He offers to teach you, if you'd like. Says it's much faster than writing everything down." For the first time in 6 weeks, Lydia felt something other than mere survival stirring in her chest. She nodded, perhaps too eagerly, and Elias's smile widened. He signed something brief. Emma translated it as "good," then indicated the shirt with a questioning gesture. Lydia examined it more carefully, then held up 3 fingers, pointed to the clock, and made a sewing motion. 3 hours. Elias nodded his understanding, signed what was clearly a thank you, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back, signing something to Emma. "He'll be back at 4, Emma said, but there was something in her expression, a knowing look that made Lydia's cheeks warm. She spent the next 3 hours on the shirt, taking far more care than was strictly necessary. The tear was significant, but she reinforced the entire shoulder seam and added subtle decorative stitching that made the repair look intentional rather than necessary. As she worked, her mind kept returning to those storm gray eyes and the way his hands had moved through the air with such grace and purpose. True to his word, Elias returned at 4 o'clock. When Lydia presented the repaired shirt, he examined her work with obvious appreciation. He tried to pay her, but Emma waved him off, saying Lydia's work was covered under the shop's general services. Then Elias did something unexpected. He signed to Emma, who raised an eyebrow but translated, "He wants to know if you'd like to learn some basic signs now. He has time, and the shop is quiet." Lydia glanced at Emma, who nodded permission. "Go ahead. Mrs. Morrison's dress can wait an hour." For the next hour, Elias taught her basic signs. "Hello, thank you, please, yes, number." He was patient and encouraging, repeating each sign until her hands moved correctly. When she struggled with a particularly complex movement, he would gently adjust her fingers, his touch careful and respectful, but sending unexpected warmth through her arms. He taught her to sign her name, showing her how to create a unique sign that represented her rather than just spelling out the letters. After some thought, he suggested a sign that combined the motion for quiet with the sign for strength. Lydia found herself blinking back tears at the unexpected kindness of it, being defined not by her limitation, but by her resilience. When he finally had to leave, he signed something to her directly, slowly enough that she could understand. "Practice," he signed. "I'll come back next week." After he left, Emma studied Lydia with those sharp eyes of hers. "That's the most animated I've seen Elias in years," she said thoughtfully. "He usually keeps to himself out at that ranch, only comes to town when he absolutely needs something." Lydia wrote on her slate, "Why did he learn to sign? Was he born deaf?" Emma shook her head. "Measles when he was 8. Nearly died. When he recovered, his hearing was gone. His parents sent him to a special school back east for a few years, where he learned sign language. But this town..." She sighed. "Most people here don't know what to make of him. They respect him. He runs one of the most successful cattle operations in the valley, but they don't know how to talk to him, or they're afraid of the silence." She paused, then added meaningfully, "He doesn't usually offer to teach anyone sign language. Most people aren't interested in learning." That night, Lydia lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house, practicing the signs Elias had taught her. Her hands moved through the darkness, forming words she couldn't speak aloud. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt something like hope. Not for romance, she had learned that lesson painfully, but for connection, for understanding, for a conversation that didn't require her to struggle against her damaged voice. True to his word, Elias returned the next week. This time he brought a book, an illustrated guide to sign language that looked well worn from use. He gave it to her with signs she interpreted as, "for you to practice." Their lessons became a weekly occurrence. Every Thursday afternoon, Elias would arrive at the shop with some excuse, a button to be sewn, a small tear to be mended, and would spend an hour teaching Lydia new signs. Emma never complained about the lost work time, seeming to understand that something important was happening in those quiet exchanges. As the weeks passed, Lydia's vocabulary grew. She learned signs for emotions, for everyday objects, for actions and descriptions. She learned that sign language wasn't just about replacing spoken words, but about expressing meaning through movement, facial expression, and the use of space. It was like learning to dance with her hands, each gesture flowing into the next in a visual poetry that felt more natural to her than spoken language ever had. Elias was a good teacher, patient and creative. When she struggled to remember a sign, he would create little stories or visual associations to help her. The sign for butterfly, he showed her, looked like wings fluttering. The sign for home was all the fingertips brought together like a roof. Each lesson revealed not just the language, but something about Elias himself, his humor, his intelligence, his way of seeing the world. One Thursday, about 2 months into their lessons, Elias arrived looking troubled. Instead of their usual lesson, he signed to Emma, who translated with obvious concern. "There's been trouble at his ranch," she told Lydia. "Someone cut his fences last night, let about 30 head of cattle wander off. He spent all morning rounding them up." Lydia's hands moved before she could think. Who would do that? Elias watched her sign, and his expression shifted from surprise to something warmer. He signed back slowly. "People who think different means less than." The weight of those words settled over the shop. Lydia knew that weight, had carried it since childhood. She signed back carefully. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but she could see the hurt beneath his casual dismissal. Then he signed something to Emma, who hesitated before translating. "He wants to know if you'd like to see his ranch sometime. He says it's easier to practice sign language without—" Emma paused, clearly editing, "without an audience." Lydia felt her cheeks warm. A proper lady didn't visit a man's ranch unchaperoned. But then again, a proper lady didn't work in a shop or live in a boarding house or communicate through hand gestures. She had left propriety on that train platform the day Charles Morton rejected her. She signed her answer directly to Elias. Yes. The following Sunday, Elias arrived at the boarding house in a wagon. Martha had been scandalized when Lydia told her about the visit, but had been somewhat mollified when Lydia explained that Emma had packed a lunch for them and that she would be back before dark. "You be careful," Martha warned. "Elias Gray is a good man, but people will talk." People were already talking, Lydia thought, but she kept that observation to herself. The ride to the ranch was unlike any conversation Lydia had ever experienced. Elias had rigged a special holder for the reins so he could free his hands periodically to sign. He pointed out landmarks, telling her stories about the valley in a mixture of signs and fingerspelling. She learned that the mountain to the north was called Temple Peak because of its distinctive shape, that the river they crossed had flooded 3 years ago and washed away the original bridge, that the red-tailed hawk circling overhead had a nest in the big pine tree they were passing. His ranch, when they finally arrived, took her breath away. It wasn't large or ostentatious, but it was clearly well-managed and cared for. The main house was built of logs, solid and warm-looking with a wide porch that faced the mountains. The barn and outbuildings were in good repair, and she could see cattle dotting the distant pastures, their black and brown forms stark against the spring grass. But what struck her most was the quiet. Not silence. There was the wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the songs of birds, but an absence of human noise, of demands and judgment and cruel words. It was a quiet that felt full rather than empty. Elias helped her down from the wagon, then signed, "Welcome to my home." He showed her around the ranch with obvious pride. The barn where he kept his horses, including a gentle mare he was training. The garden plot he was preparing for summer vegetables. The small creek that ran along the eastern boundary of his property, its water clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. And finally, the house itself. The interior was simple but comfortable. What struck Lydia immediately were the books, shelves and shelves of them lining the walls of the main room. Books on agriculture and animal husbandry, certainly, but also poetry, philosophy, novels, histories, a leather-bound set of Shakespeare. a collection of botanical illustrations. Books in English, but also what looked like French and German. Seeing her amazement, Elias signed, "When you can't fill your world with voices, you fill it with ideas." They spent the afternoon on the porch, Elias teaching her more complex signs, how to indicate time, how to show possession, how to ask questions. He taught her the signs for different animals, demonstrating by pointing to the actual creatures as they appeared: horse, cow, chicken, dog. His dog, a mixed breed with intelligent eyes, seemed fascinated by their silent conversation, tilting his head as their hands moved. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Elias grew more serious. He signed slowly, making sure she understood. "People in town. They think we are broken. But here, on this land, I am whole. My cows don't care that I can't hear. The sunrise doesn't require me to speak. The work gets done just the same." Lydia signed back. "Charles said I was defective." "Damaged goods." Elias's face darkened. He signed emphatically, "Charles Morton is a fool." "You are not damaged. You are—" He paused, thinking, then signed, "You are like a painting in a world of noise. People are so busy talking, they forget to really see." The poetry of it, expressed in the movement of his hands, made her eyes burn with unshed tears. She signed, "Thank you." He smiled, that warm, genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. Then he signed something she didn't understand, too complex for her current vocabulary. Seeing her confusion, he fingerspelled slowly, "Treasure." On the ride back to town, Lydia felt something fundamental had shifted. She had spent months defining herself by Charles's rejection, by her inability to meet the world's expectations of what a woman should be. But in Elias's presence, in the quiet understanding of his signs, she began to imagine a different possibility. The next week, their usual lesson was interrupted by the arrival of Charles Morton himself at the shop. Lydia was in the back room but could hear his booming voice. "Emma, I need a new shirt made, something fine. I'm courting the widow Harrison, and I need to look my best." Lydia's hand stilled on the fabric she was hemming. Through the doorway, she could see Charles examining fabric samples, his back to her. Then Elias entered the shop for his weekly visit, and Charles turned. "Well, well," Charles said loudly, his voice dripping with disdain. "If it isn't the deaf rancher. Come to get your rags mended?" Elias, of course, couldn't hear the insult, but he could read the hostility in Charles's posture and expression. He moved past him without acknowledgement, heading toward the back room where he knew Lydia would be. "Hey!" Charles grabbed Elias's shoulder roughly. "I'm talking to you, you defective—" What happened next occurred so quickly that Lydia almost missed it. Elias turned, his movement fluid and controlled, and in one smooth motion had Charles's wrist in his grip, applying just enough pressure to make the other man release his shoulder. Then he let go, stepped back, and signed something sharp and dismissive. Emma, who had witnessed the exchange, translated in a deadly calm voice. "Mr. Gray says that if you touch him again, you'll learn that being deaf hasn't affected his ability to defend himself or his property. He also suggests you leave before you embarrass yourself further." Charles's face turned an alarming shade of red. "You dare threaten me? You and that mute woman deserve each other. Two defectives playing at being normal people." This time, Lydia stepped out from the back room. Her hands moved in signs she had practiced, signs Elias had taught her just the week before. Emma translated, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Mr. Gray and I may not speak with our voices, but we communicate with more honesty and depth than you could manage with all your loud words. You rejected me because you couldn't see past my silence to my worth. That was your loss, not mine. Now please leave. Your business is not welcome here." The shop fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Charles looked from Lydia to Elias to Emma, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Finally, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Emma broke the tension with a laugh. "Well, that was worth the price of admission. Lydia, dear, I do believe you found your voice after all." But Lydia was looking at Elias, who was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He signed slowly, "You defended me." She signed back, "You defended me first." Something passed between them in that moment, something that didn't require signs or words or sounds. It was understanding, recognition, and perhaps the beginning of something more. That evening, as Lydia walked back to the boarding house, she found herself thinking about voice and silence, about what it meant to be heard versus being understood. Charles Morton had rejected her for her lack of voice, but in doing so, he had freed her to find something better, a language of hands and hearts, a connection that transcended the limitations others saw in her. The weeks following Charles Morton's humiliating departure from Emma's shop brought unexpected changes to Willow Creek's social landscape. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, as such things do in small towns, and Lydia found herself the subject of renewed scrutiny. But this time, the whispers carried a different tone, curiosity mixed with a grudging respect. "Did you hear what she said to Morton?" Lydia overheard Mrs. Patterson telling her companion at the general store. Emma translated every word, put him right in his place. "About time someone did," the other woman replied. "That man's been strutting around town like a peacock ever since he inherited his father's land." Lydia kept her head down, selecting thread for a commission, but she felt a small flame of satisfaction warm her chest. She had spent so many months feeling diminished by Charles's rejection, and now, finally, the narrative was beginning to shift. At the shop, Emma noticed the change too. "You're standing taller," she observed one morning as Lydia arranged a new shipment of buttons. "And Elias certainly seems to be finding more reasons to visit town." It was true. What had been weekly visits for lessons had become twice weekly, then 3 times. Elias would arrive with various pretexts, a tear in his work pants, a missing button, a request for Emma to order particular supplies, but his real purpose was transparent. He came to see Lydia, to continue their conversations in sign, to share the silent understanding that had grown between them. One particularly warm April afternoon, Elias arrived at the shop with an unusual request. Through Emma's translation, he explained, "The school board has asked me to speak, sign, to the children about ranching. The teacher, Miss Brennan, knows some sign language from her training back east. She thinks it would be educational for the students to learn about different ways of communicating. Would you come with me? You could help translate if needed." Lydia felt a flutter of anxiety. She had avoided the schoolhouse, avoided children who might stare or ask uncomfortable questions. But the hope in Elias's eyes made her nod before she could think better of it. The following Friday, they arrived at the small schoolhouse on the edge of town. Miss Brennan, a young woman with intelligent eyes and an eager manner, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Gray, Miss Bennett, thank you so much for coming. The children are very curious about sign language. 22 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, sat in neat rows, their eyes wide with curiosity. Lydia recognized several of them, the Baker twins, whose mother frequented Emma's shop, young Timothy Morrison, whose sister was getting married, Sarah Hendricks, whose father ran the bank. Miss Brennan introduced them, explaining that Mr. Gray was deaf and Miss Bennett had difficulty speaking, but that they would be communicating through sign language. "This is a wonderful opportunity," she told the class, "to learn that there are many ways to share ideas and feelings." Elias began by showing the children basic signs. Hello, goodbye, thank you. The younger ones giggled as they tried to copy his movements, their small hands clumsy but enthusiastic. Then he began to tell them about ranching, with Miss Brennan translating his signs and Lydia helping when the teacher struggled with certain phrases. He explained how he trained horses using visual cues instead of voice commands, how he could feel the vibrations of approaching storms through the ground, how his other senses had sharpened to compensate for his lack of hearing. The children were fascinated, especially when he demonstrated how he could identify different animals by their movement patterns alone. "But how do you know when your cows are in trouble?" young Timothy asked. "My pa says you gotta listen for when they're distressed." Elias smiled and signed his response, which Lydia translated by writing on the slate at the front of the room. "I watch their body language. A distressed cow moves differently than a content one. Their ears, their tails, their posture, it all tells a story if you know how to read it." Sarah Hendricks raised her hand. "Miss Bennett, why can't you talk normal?" The blunt question of childhood hung in the air. Lydia felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but then she caught Elias's encouraging look. She wrote carefully on the slate, "I had a very high fever when I was young. It damaged my voice. I can speak, but only in a whisper. Like a secret? One of the younger children asked excitedly. Lydia found herself smiling as she wrote, "Yes, like I'm always telling secrets." "That's not so bad," the child declared with 6-year-old certainty. "I wish I could only talk in secrets." The innocent acceptance nearly undid her. She felt Elias's hand brush hers briefly, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Miss Brennan. The visit was such a success that Miss Brennan asked if they would return monthly to teach the children more sign language. "It's valuable for them to learn," she insisted. "And honestly, it might help with the Crawford boy. He's partially deaf in one ear from a childhood infection. This could make such a difference for him." Walking back to town after the school visit, Elias and Lydia took the longer route along the creek. Spring had fully arrived in Montana, painting the valley with wildflowers and filling the air with the sound of birdsong and rushing water from the mountain snowmelt. They stopped at a fallen log that served as a natural bench, and Elias pulled out the lunch Emma had packed for them. As they ate in companionable silence, Lydia became aware of how comfortable she had become with quiet. Before, silence had felt like a prison, a constant reminder of what she couldn't do. But with Elias, silence was simply another form of presence, as full and meaningful as any conversation. He touched her shoulder gently to get her attention, then signed something she had to ask him to repeat more slowly. "I want to show you something," he signed. "At my ranch. Tomorrow, if you're free." She nodded, curious. He seemed both excited and nervous, an unusual combination for someone typically so steady. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, but Elias arrived at the boarding house as promised. Martha had given up protesting these visits, though she still muttered about propriety whenever she thought Lydia couldn't see her. The ride to the ranch was quiet even by their standards. Elias seemed preoccupied, his jaw set with determination. When they arrived, instead of heading to the house, he led her to a small building she hadn't noticed on her previous visit, set back among a grove of aspens. He opened the door to reveal a workshop filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects. But what caught her attention was the far wall, covered in something unexpected, framed charcoal drawings. Landscapes mostly, capturing the valley in different seasons and moods. But there were portraits too, including one that made her breath catch. It was her, captured in profile as she sewed, her hands graceful over the fabric, her face serene in concentration. The artist had captured something she had never seen in herself, a quiet strength, a beauty that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with presence. She turned to Elias, her eyes wide with questions. He signed slowly, almost shyly, "I draw what speaks to me without words. The land, the animals, you." She moved closer to the wall, studying each drawing. They were remarkably good, displaying not just technical skill but an emotional depth that revealed the artist's soul. There were pictures of the ranch in a thunderstorm, cattle moving like shadows across snow, the town viewed from the mountain pass. And scattered among them, like secrets hidden in plain sight, were more drawings of her. Lydia teaching signs to the school children, Lydia walking along the creek, Lydia laughing at something Emma had said. "How long?" she signed. "Since the first day you repaired my shirt," he admitted. "You looked at me and saw a person, not a problem to be solved or pitied. Do you know how rare that is?" Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. She signed back, her movements emphatic. "You did the same for me." He moved closer, his hands continuing to speak. "I need to tell you something, ask you something, but I need to know you understand fully." He switched to fingerspelling, going slowly to make sure she caught every letter. IAMFALLINGINLOVEWITHYOU. The workshop seemed to hold its breath. Rain pattered softly on the roof, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied. Lydia's hands trembled as she raised them to respond. She had learned so many signs over the past months, but none of them seemed adequate for this moment. Finally, she stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, close enough to smell the leather and soap scent of him. She placed one hand over his heart, feeling its rapid beat, then placed his hand over hers. The sign for same. What she felt was the same as what he felt. Elias's face transformed with joy, but before he could respond, they heard horses approaching rapidly. Through the workshop window, they could see 3 riders coming hard down the ranch road. Elias frowned, recognizing trouble in their haste. They emerged from the workshop to meet the riders, Sheriff Hawkins and 2 deputies. The sheriff's face was grim as he dismounted. "Elias," he said, speaking clearly so Elias could read his lips, while also signing what he knew. "We've got a problem. Someone's been spreading rumors that you've been mistreating your cattle, that your deafness makes you unfit to run a ranch. Charles Morton has filed a formal complaint with the Cattlemen's Association. They're sending an inspector tomorrow." Lydia felt rage surge through her. She pulled out her ever-present slate and wrote furiously, "This is revenge. Charles is trying to hurt Elias because of me." The sheriff read her words and nodded grimly. "I figured as much, but the association has to investigate any formal complaint. Inspector's coming from Helena. Name's Richardson. He's known to be fair, but—" He hesitated, then continued. "He's also never dealt with a deaf rancher before. Might have some preconceived notions." After the sheriff left, Elias stood rigid, staring at the mountains. Lydia touched his arm gently, and when he turned to her, she saw something she had never seen in his eyes before. Fear. Not of the inspector or even of losing his ranch, but of something deeper. He signed slowly, "If they take the ranch, I have nothing to offer you." She grabbed his hand, stopping his words. Then she signed with fierce determination, "You are not your ranch. You are the man who sees beauty in silence, who teaches children that different doesn't mean less, who draws pictures that capture souls. That is what you offer. That is what matters." He pulled her into an embrace then, the first time they had held each other. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, could feel him trembling slightly. When they finally pulled apart, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set with determination. They spent the rest of the day preparing for the inspector's visit. Elias showed Lydia his meticulous records. Every purchase, every sale, every veterinary visit, every improvement to the land. His documentation was more thorough than most speaking ranchers because he had learned early that he needed to prove his competence constantly. That evening, as Elias drove her back to town, they stopped at Emma's shop. Emma was working late, and her eyes sharpened when she saw their expressions. "What's happened?" she demanded. When they explained about the inspector, Emma's face darkened with anger. "That snake Morton. He can't stand that you both rejected him. Yes, Elias, you rejected him too, by being everything he's not. Honorable, hardworking, genuine." She thought for a moment, then said, "We need to be strategic. Inspector Richardson will expect to find a deficient operation because that's what he's been told to expect. We need to show him something different from the moment he arrives. Lydia, can you be there tomorrow?" Lydia nodded immediately, though she wasn't sure what help she could provide. "Good," Emma said, "and I'll spread the word tonight. Charles Morton isn't the only one with influence in this town." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Lydia arrived at Elias's ranch early, driven by Emma's husband, Robert, who had taken the day off from his work at the bank specifically to help. They weren't alone. Several other townsfolk had gathered, including Miss Brennan from the school, old Dr. Sullivan, who had tended Elias's cattle for years, and surprisingly, Mrs. Morrison, whose wedding dress Emma was making. "What Charles Morton is doing is wrong," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "Elias Gray has helped every person here at some point, pulling wagons from mud, rounding up escaped horses, sharing his water during the drought 2 years ago. We won't stand by and watch him be railroaded." Inspector Richardson arrived at noon, a thin man with skeptical eyes and a clipboard that he wielded like a weapon. Charles Morton accompanied him, claiming his right as the complainant to observe the inspection. "Mr. Gray," the inspector said slowly and loudly, as if volume would somehow penetrate Elias's deafness. "I need to inspect your operation for signs of neglect or mismanagement." Miss Brennan stepped forward. "Mr. Richardson, I can translate using sign language if you'd prefer to communicate more efficiently." The inspector looked surprised, but nodded curtly. Through Miss Brennan's translation, he began his interrogation. How did Elias know when animals were in distress? How did he communicate with his ranch hands? How could he possibly manage cattle drives without being able to hear? For each question, Elias had not just an answer, but a demonstration. He showed how he had trained his horses to respond to hand signals. He demonstrated the mirror system he had installed in the barn to see around corners. He presented his written agreements with his ranch hands, which were actually more detailed and clear than verbal agreements would have been. Dr. Sullivan stepped forward. "I've been veterinarian to 5 ranches in this valley for 15 years, he said. "Elias Gray's cattle are consistently the healthiest I see. He notices problems earlier than most because he's actually observing his animals, not just listening for obvious distress." The inspector moved through the ranch, examining everything from the fences to the feed stores to the cattle themselves. And at every turn, he found excellence. The fences were not just maintained, but improved with Elias's own design that prevented snowdrift damage. The feed was stored with a rotation system that prevented spoilage. The cattle were healthy, well-fed, and remarkably calm. "The animals are calm because he's calm," Miss Brennan explained as they watched Elias move among his herd. "He doesn't shout or make sudden movements. The cattle trust him." Charles Morton grew increasingly agitated as the inspection proceeded. "This is all for show," he protested. "They've obviously prepared for this." "Of course we prepared," Mrs. Morrison said sharply. "When someone makes false accusations, preparation is necessary to reveal the truth." The inspector was examining the ranch books when he paused, looking up at Elias with surprise. "These records go back 8 years, and they're impeccable. More detailed than any I've seen. Through Miss Brennan," Elias signed, "when you can't call out numbers to someone else to record, you learn to write everything down immediately. When you can't explain verbally, you learn to document thoroughly." As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the inspector was finding nothing to support Charles's complaint. If anything, he was discovering an operation that surpassed normal standards in almost every way. Finally, Charles lost his composure entirely. "This is ridiculous. The man is deaf. He can't possibly run a ranch properly. What happens in an emergency? What happens when there's a stampede or a fire or a storm?" Lydia had been silent throughout the inspection, standing supportively near Elias, but not interfering. Now, however, she stepped forward, pulling out her slate. She wrote quickly and showed it to Miss Brennan to read aloud. "Mr. Morton assumes that hearing is necessary for competence, just as he assumed that a full voice was necessary for a wife's worth. He was wrong then, and he is wrong now. Elias Gray has run this ranch successfully for 8 years. He has survived storms, droughts, and floods. He has dealt with injured animals, difficult births, and yes, even stampedes. He has done all of this not in spite of his deafness, but by developing skills and systems that many hearing ranchers would benefit from learning." She continued writing, her chalk moving forcefully across the slate. "The real threat to ranching in this valley is not a man who cannot hear, but men like Charles Morton who cannot see past their own prejudices, who file false complaints out of petty vengeance, who waste the time and resources of legitimate institutions because their pride has been wounded." The silence that followed her words was profound. Even Charles seemed struck dumb. Inspector Richardson studied her for a long moment, then turned to Charles. "Mr. Morton," he said coldly, "I find no evidence whatsoever of mismanagement or neglect at this ranch. What I do find is an exemplary operation run by a man who has overcome significant challenges to create something remarkable. I also find that you have wasted my time, the association's resources, and damaged your own reputation with what appears to be a frivolous complaint motivated by personal animosity." He turned to Elias and, speaking clearly while Miss Brennan signed, said, "Mr. Gray, I apologize for this intrusion. I'll be filing my report with a full commendation of your operation. I'll also be recommending that the association consider implementing some of your documentation practices as standard recommendations for all ranchers." After the inspector and a humiliated Charles Morton departed, the gathered crowd erupted in celebration. People clapped Elias on the back, shook his hand, and signed "good job" with varying degrees of accuracy. Mrs. Morrison surprised everyone by signing quite fluidly, "My nephew is deaf. You've inspired me to practice more." As the crowd gradually dispersed, Elias and Lydia found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The events of the day had been exhausting but exhilarating, proving something important not just to the town but to themselves. Elias signed to her, "You defended me again." Stronger this time. We defended each other, she signed back. That's what partners do. The word hung between them. Partners. Not just in this crisis, but perhaps in something larger, something permanent. Elias stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over his land. Their land, perhaps, someday. When he turned back to her, his hands moved with careful deliberation. Lydia Bennett, he signed, then switched to fingerspelling to make sure she understood every word. Willyoumarryme. The proposal shouldn't have been a surprise after everything that had happened, but Lydia still felt her breath catch. She thought of the woman who had stepped off the train months ago, destroyed by rejection, believing her worth was tied to her ability to speak loudly enough to be heard. That woman could never have imagined this moment, being proposed to by a man who heard her perfectly in her silence, who saw her not as damaged goods, but as a complete person. She stood and moved to face him, the sunset painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Her hands rose to sign her answer, but then she did something else first. She leaned forward and kissed him, softly, a promise made without words or signs. When she pulled back, she saw her answer reflected in his eyes before she even signed it. Yes, her hand said. Then, to make absolutely certain he understood the depth of her feeling, she signed the phrase he had taught her just that week, with all my heart. The kiss that followed was longer, deeper, a conversation in itself. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Elias's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But even in their joy, they both knew this was not the end of their challenges. The town might have witnessed Elias's vindication today, but there would still be those who saw their union as an oddity, a matching of misfits rather than a true love story. There would still be Charles Morton's wounded pride to contend with, and the practical challenges of building a life together in a world not designed for people like them. As if reading her thoughts, Elias signed. It won't be easy. The best things never are, she signed back, then added with a small smile. Besides, we've already proven we can face whatever comes. We have our own language, remember? The world can't touch what it doesn't understand. They stood together on the porch as darkness fell, not speaking, not signing, just being present with each other and with the vast Montana sky that stretched endlessly above them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and its pack answered, their voices carrying across the valley in a primitive chorus. Elias felt the vibrations through the porch boards and smiled, pulling Lydia closer. She realized that he experienced the world in ways she was only beginning to understand, through vibrations, through visual cues, through the subtle changes in air pressure that preceded weather shifts. Just as she had learned to communicate through signs and writing, she would learn to experience his world, this rich landscape of sensation beyond sound. The next few days passed in a blur of planning and revelation. News of their engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, generating reactions ranging from genuine happiness to scandalized whispers. Emma was overjoyed, immediately beginning work on Lydia's wedding dress. It will be my masterpiece, she declared, something that speaks without words just like you do. Martha at the boarding house was torn between scandal and sentiment. It's not proper. You going to live out there alone with him before the wedding, she fretted, but then added with a soft smile, though I suppose propriety hasn't served you particularly well so far. The most unexpected reaction came from Widow Harrison, the woman Charles Morton had been courting. She arrived at Emma's shop 3 days after the inspection, her face set with determination. Miss Bennett, she said formally, then surprised Lydia by continuing in hesitant but recognizable sign language. I learned a little when my sister's boy was born deaf. I wanted to tell you something. She proceeded to explain through a mixture of signs and speech that Emma helped interpret that Charles Morton had been spreading poison about both Lydia and Elias throughout his courtship of her. He seemed to think it would impress me, showing how he had escaped from you and how he was protecting the town from Elias's incompetence, she said with disgust. I ended our association immediately. A man who builds himself up by tearing others down is no man at all. She paused, then added, I'll be telling others what I know. Charles Morton has shown his true character, and this town needs to see it clearly. As the widow Harrison departed, Lydia felt another shift in the social currents of Willow Creek. The narrative was changing, reshaping itself around a different understanding of worth and value. That evening, she and Elias met with Reverend Paul to discuss their wedding. The elderly minister had initially been hesitant about presiding over such an unusual union, but his wife, who had been partially deaf for the last decade, had convinced him otherwise. "Love speaks in many languages," Mrs. Paul said firmly. "If you can't see that, Thomas, then you've forgotten the very essence of your calling." Properly chastened, Reverend Paul agreed to perform the ceremony. Through Emma's translation, he asked them about their plans for the service. "Simple," Elias signed. "We don't need words to make promises. Our actions, our commitment, our life together, that's what matters." They decided on a small ceremony at the ranch, with only their closest supporters present. Miss Brennan would translate the essential parts, but much of the ceremony would be conducted in sign language, allowing Elias and Lydia to make their vows directly to each other. As they planned, Lydia couldn't help but think how different this was from what she had imagined when she first answered Charles's advertisement. She had pictured a traditional wedding in a small church with all the conventional trappings. Instead, she would be married under the open sky, making silent vows to a man who heard her heart better than anyone who had ever listened to her voice. 2 weeks before the wedding, an unexpected challenge arose. A letter arrived at the ranch from an organization in Helena, the Montana Institute for the Advancement of Deaf Education. They had heard about Elias's successful ranch and his upcoming marriage to Lydia. They wanted to feature them in their newsletter, to hold them up as an example of what deaf individuals could achieve. Elias was conflicted. He signed to Lydia, "I just want to live our life, not be a symbol." "But maybe," Lydia signed back, "by living our life openly and successfully, we make it easier for others like us." That little boy at the school with partial hearing, maybe seeing us will show him he doesn't have to limit his dreams. After much discussion, they agreed to a brief article, but on their terms. They would tell their own story, in their own way, without sensationalism or pity. The journalist who came to interview them was herself partially deaf, which immediately put them at ease. Through a combination of sign language, writing, and Emma's translation, they told their story, not as a tale of overcoming disability, but as a love story between two people who found in each other a matching soul. "What would you tell other deaf individuals who might be afraid to pursue their dreams?" the journalist asked. Elias thought for a moment, then signed. "The world will tell you that you're limited. Some people will see you as broken. But limitation and brokenness exist in their perception, not in your reality. Build your life according to your own capabilities, not their expectations." Lydia added, writing on her slate, "Find your own language, whether it's signs or writing or art, or simply the way you move through the world. Once you find it, use it boldly." The article would eventually be published and would indeed inspire others, but for now, Elias and Lydia focused on the immediate future, their wedding, and the life they would build together. 3 days before the ceremony, Charles Morton made one last attempt to cause trouble. He appeared at the ranch with a legal document claiming that Elias had agreed to sell him water rights years ago and demanding access to the creek that ran through the property. Elias studied the document, then went to his meticulously kept files and produced the actual agreement from 5 years prior. It clearly showed that Charles had declined to purchase water rights when offered, calling them overpriced for land owned by a defective. Sheriff Hawkins, who had accompanied Charles to ensure no violence occurred, read both documents and shook his head. "Charles, this is getting pathetic," he said bluntly. "You're forging documents now? That's a serious crime." Faced with potential arrest, Charles backed down, but not before delivering one last verbal attack. "You think you've won," he snarled at Lydia, "but you're both freaks, and everyone knows it. This whole town is laughing at you behind your backs." Lydia pulled out her slate one last time for Charles Morton. She wrote slowly, deliberately, "If they're laughing, I can't hear them. Neither can Elias. Your words have no power here. You rejected me for my silence, but that rejection led me to someone who values what I am rather than mourning what I'm not. You didn't break me, Charles. You freed me." She paused, then added, "I hope someday you find whatever it is that makes you so angry and small." Until then, stay off our land. The word our was deliberate, possessive, proud. Charles's face turned purple, but with the sheriff standing right there, he could do nothing but retreat. As his horse disappeared down the road, Elias signed to Lydia. Our land. I like how that sounds. Looks, she corrected with a smile, signing back. I like how it looks. He laughed, that unique laugh of his that was felt more than heard, his whole body expressing joy. It was one of the things she had come to love most about him, these pure expressions of emotion unfiltered by social conventions about how laughter should sound. The morning of the wedding dawned with a spectacular sunrise that painted the Montana sky in shades of rose and gold. Lydia stood at the window of Emma's spare room, where she had spent her last night as an unmarried woman, watching the light transform the mountains from dark silhouettes into majestic peaks crowned with snow. Her wedding dress hung nearby, its simple elegance a testament to Emma's skill and understanding. The cream-colored silk seemed to glow in the early light, its only adornment a pattern of delicate embroidery at the neckline that, upon closer inspection, revealed tiny hand signs spelling out words of love and commitment. Emma appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "Nervous?" she asked, though she signed the word as well, a habit she had developed over the months of knowing Lydia. Lydia shook her head, then reconsidered and nodded, laughing silently at her own contradiction. She wrote on the small slate she kept always at hand, not nervous about marrying Elias, nervous about everyone watching. "There won't be many," Emma assured her. "Just 20 or so of us who actually care about you both. This isn't a performance, Lydia. It's a promise." As Emma helped her dress, carefully fastening the long row of pearl buttons that ran down the back of the gown, Lydia thought about promises. She had come to Montana on the promise of marriage to Charles Morton, a promise that had shattered the moment he heard her damaged voice. But that broken promise had led to something far more valuable, a man who didn't need to hear her voice to understand her soul. Martha arrived with a small bouquet of wildflowers that Miss Brennan's students had gathered. "The children wanted you to have these," she said, her eyes suspiciously bright. "They picked them yesterday after school, said they wanted you to carry something from all of them." Among the lupines and Indian paintbrush, Lydia noticed small folded papers tucked between the stems. She pulled one out and read the childish scrawl. "Thank you for teaching us to talk with our hands. Love, Timothy." Another read, "You and Mr. Gray are brave. From Sarah." The tears she had been holding back all morning finally spilled over. Emma quickly produced a handkerchief, scolding gently, "Don't you dare ruin my masterpiece of a dress with tear stains." The ceremony was scheduled for noon at the ranch. Robert, Emma's husband, drove them out in his best carriage, which he had decorated with ribbons and flowers despite Lydia's protests that she didn't need any fuss. The road to the ranch had never seemed longer or shorter. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously as they drew closer to the moment that would change everything. When they arrived, Lydia gasped at the transformation. The area in front of the house had been decorated with garlands of evergreen and wildflowers. Chairs had been arranged in a small semicircle facing the mountains, and a simple arch of woven branches stood where Reverend Paul waited. But what moved her most was seeing Elias's ranch hands, tough men who had initially been skeptical of their boss's choice, wearing their cleanest clothes and attempting to sign welcome as she approached. Elias himself stood near the arch, and when he turned to see her, his expression made every moment of pain and rejection she had endured worthwhile. He was wearing a new black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, but it was his face that captured her. The wonder, the joy, the complete certainty that she was exactly what he wanted. Miss Brennan stood ready to translate, and the small gathering of guests took their seats. Dr. Sullivan was there with his wife, the widow Harrison with her sister's deaf son, Sheriff Hawkins and his family, and several other townspeople who had come to respect and support the unusual couple. Notably absent was Charles Morton, who had reportedly left town on urgent business rather than witness the wedding. Reverend Paul began the ceremony with traditional words, which Miss Brennan signed for Elias. But when it came time for the vows, something extraordinary happened. Elias and Lydia turned to face each other fully, and the Reverend stepped back, allowing them to make their promises directly to one another in their shared language of silence. Elias's hands moved with deliberate care. Lydia, you came into my silent world and filled it with conversation. You saw in me not what was missing, but what was present. I promise to be your voice when you need one, your strength when you feel weak, and your partner in all things. I promise to read your heart as carefully as I read your signs, and to love you through every season this land brings us. Lydia's response came through her hands with equal emotion. Elias, you taught me that silence is not emptiness, but possibility. You showed me that being heard has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with understanding. I promise to be your ears when you need them, your companion in quietness and in joy, and your wife in all the ways that matter. I promise to speak to you with my hands, my eyes, and my heart for all the days of our lives. There wasn't a dry eye among the witnesses. Even Sheriff Hawkins, a man not known for sentiment, had to clear his throat repeatedly. The widow Harrison's nephew watched with wide eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time that his deafness didn't have to define his limits. When Reverend Paul pronounced them husband and wife, Elias pulled Lydia into a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a seal on promises made without words. The small gathering erupted in applause, some clapping, others waving their hands in the air in the deaf applause Elias had taught them. The wedding feast that followed was held in the barn, which had been transformed with lanterns and ribbons. Emma had outdone herself with the food, and there was music for those who could hear it, provided by a fiddle player from town. But what Lydia remembered most clearly was the moment when Elias led her onto the makeshift dance floor. I can't hear the music, he had signed to her with a smile, but I can feel the rhythm through the floor. Dance with me? They moved together, not perfectly in time with the fiddle, but in perfect synchronization with each other. Elias held her close, one hand on her waist, the other holding hers, and she could feel his heartbeat against her chest, a rhythm more meaningful than any melody. Around them, their guests watched with expressions ranging from admiration to wonder, seeing in this silent dance something that transcended their understanding of how things should be. As the afternoon wore on, unexpected guests began to arrive. Word had spread through the valley that something special was happening at the Gray Ranch, and curious townspeople came to witness it for themselves. Some came skeptically, expecting to see something pitiable or strange. Instead, they found a celebration of genuine joy, a couple who communicated with such fluid grace that spoken words seemed almost crude by comparison. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of the gossiping voices at the train station, approached Lydia during a quiet moment. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice stiff with discomfort. "When Charles Morton rejected you, I thought wrong. Watching you and Elias, it's clear that you found where you belong." Lydia wrote on her slate, "We all make mistakes in judgment. Thank you for coming today." Mrs. Patterson's face softened. "My mother went deaf in her final years. We all shouted at her thinking volume would help. Watching you two, I realized we should have learned to speak her language instead of demanding she struggle with ours." As evening approached and guests began to leave, each offering congratulations in their own way, some speaking clearly for Elias to read their lips, others attempting signs they had learned, still others simply shaking hands with warm smiles. Lydia felt a sense of community she hadn't expected to find in this rough Montana town. Dr. Sullivan pulled Elias aside for a moment, and through Miss Brennan's translation said, "I've been corresponding with a colleague in Chicago who works with deaf patients. He's developed some new techniques for teaching lip reading and sign language. I thought you might be interested, especially if you and Lydia are blessed with children." The mention of children made both Elias and Lydia blush, but it also opened up a conversation they hadn't yet had. After the guests departed and they were finally alone in their home, they sat before the fireplace and discussed their future. "Are you afraid?" Elias signed. "If we have children who are deaf like me or who have voice problems like you?" Lydia considered carefully before responding. "I'm afraid of many things. Illness, accidents, all the things that can go wrong on a ranch. But I'm not afraid of having children like us. Look what we've built despite what others call limitations. Our children, however they come to us, will be loved and will learn that there are many ways to be in this world." Their wedding night was a discovery of another kind of communication, one that required neither voice nor signs but spoke volumes nonetheless. In the darkness of their bedroom, with moonlight filtering through the curtains, they learned each other's rhythms and responses, creating a private language that belonged only to them. The first weeks of married life brought adjustments and revelations. Lydia moved her few possessions from the boarding house to the ranch, transforming the bachelor dwelling into a true home. She added curtains to the windows, arranged flowers in mason jars, and created a cozy reading nook where they could spend evening hours together with their books. But more than the physical changes, there were the subtle negotiations of two people learning to share space and life. They developed routines that accommodated both their needs. Elias would tap the floor with his boot to get Lydia's attention from another room, the vibrations traveling through the floorboards. Lydia learned to position herself where Elias could see her when she needed to communicate something quickly. One morning, about 3 weeks after the wedding, they woke to find Charles Morton's cattle on their land. At first, Elias assumed the fence had broken, but upon investigation they found it had been deliberately cut. This was beyond petty harassment. It was criminal destruction of property and theft of grazing land. Sheriff Hawkins arrived quickly when summoned, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "This has to stop," he said firmly. "Charles has been spreading rumors in the neighboring towns, saying the marriage isn't legal because neither of you can properly consent, claims you're both mentally deficient." The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. She had thought they were past this, that their public wedding and the town's acceptance had ended Charles's campaign against them. But she realized now that a man like Charles, humiliated and rejected, would never stop trying to prove he had been right all along. "What can we do?" she wrote on her slate. "Document everything," the sheriff advised. "Every cut fence, every trespass, every incident. Build a case. And—" He hesitated, then continued, "It might be time to involve the territorial authorities. This is beyond what I can handle alone." That afternoon, while Elias repaired the fence with his ranch hands, Lydia made a decision. She sat at the kitchen table and began writing a letter, not on her slate, but on proper paper, her penmanship careful and clear. The letter was addressed to the Montana Territorial Governor, but copies would go to the newspaper in Helena, the Cattlemen's Association, and the Institute for the Advancement of Deaf Education. In the letter, she detailed not just the harassment they had endured, but the larger issue it represented. She wrote about the challenges faced by those with disabilities in the territory, the assumption that different meant less capable, the casual cruelty that masqueraded as concern for their welfare. She wrote about Elias's successful ranch, run more efficiently than many hearing men's operations. She wrote about their marriage, built on understanding and respect rather than conventional communication. But most powerfully, she wrote about the future they were trying to build, one where children like the partially deaf boy at the school could see possibility rather than limitation, where young women whose voices had been damaged by illness wouldn't be deemed worthless as wives, where the measure of a person's worth wasn't determined by their ability to hear or speak, but by their character and capabilities. When Elias read the letter that evening, his eyes widened. "This is declaration of war," he signed. "No," Lydia signed back. "It's a declaration of independence." They sent the letters the next day, not knowing what response they might receive. In the meantime, life on the ranch continued. Calving season was approaching, always a challenging time that required constant vigilance. Elias prepared carefully, setting up a system of flags that his ranch hands could raise to signal different types of emergencies, allowing him to respond quickly, even without hearing their calls. It was during this busy time that Emma arrived at the ranch with unexpected news. "There's a woman at my shop," she said, slightly out of breath from her hurried journey. "She came on yesterday's train from Boston. She's asking about you, Lydia. Says she's your cousin, Margaret." Lydia's hand flew to her throat in surprise. Margaret, Maggie, her cousin who had written faithfully until Lydia announced her plans to become a mail-order bride. The letters had stopped then, Maggie apparently disapproving of such a desperate measure. What could have brought her all the way to Montana? They returned to town with Emma to find Margaret Whitfield née Bennett waiting in the shop. She was everything Lydia remembered, elegantly dressed, perfectly coiffed, her voice cultured and clear as she greeted them. "Lydia," she said, then stopped, taking in her cousin's appearance. Gone was the defeated woman who had left Philadelphia. In her place stood someone confident, healthy from ranch work, glowing with what Margaret would later privately admit was obvious happiness. The reunion was awkward at first. Margaret struggled with the sign language, frustrated by her inability to communicate easily with Elias. But over tea in Emma's back room, with Emma translating, the story emerged. "Father died 6 months ago," Margaret explained, referring to Lydia's uncle, who had been her guardian after her parents' deaths. "In his will, he left you something. Not much. He still disapproved of your adventure, as he called it, but enough. $500 and your mother's jewelry, the pieces he'd been keeping safe." She produced a small velvet bag, and Lydia's breath caught as she recognized her mother's cameo brooch, her pearl earrings, the thin gold wedding band that had been her grandmother's, things she had thought lost forever. "But that's not really why I came," Margaret continued, her voice dropping. "I came to apologize. When you wrote about becoming a mail-order bride, I was horrified. I thought you were debasing yourself, that you should have accepted your limitations and lived quietly on the charity of relatives." She paused, visibly struggling with her next words. "I was wrong. You found your own way, and from what I can see, a much better way than what we would have offered you." She looked at Elias then, really looked at him, and seemed to see past the deafness to the man underneath. "Mr. Gray, I hope you'll forgive my initial prejudice. Lydia's letters, the few she sent after your marriage, spoke of you with such warmth that I had to come see for myself. I can see now why she chose you over the life we thought she should accept." Margaret stayed for 3 days, and during that time a bridge was rebuilt between the cousins. Margaret was fascinated by the ranch, by the silent communication between Elias and Lydia, by the way they had built a life that defied every expectation she had held. On her last evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Margaret said something that stayed with Lydia long after her cousin departed. "You know, Lydia, I spent my whole life doing what was expected, marrying well, hosting proper parties, maintaining social standing. But watching you and Elias, I realize I've never had a single conversation as meaningful as the ones you have without speaking a word. Perhaps finding your voice isn't about volume after all." A week after Margaret's departure, responses to Lydia's letters began arriving. The governor's office sent a formal acknowledgement and a promise to investigate. The Helena newspaper sent a reporter, the same woman who had interviewed them for the Institute. But most surprisingly, the Cattlemen's Association sent their president himself, a gruff man named Harrison Beck, who arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning. "Mrs. Gray," he said, tipping his hat and speaking slowly so Elias could read his lips. "Mr. Gray, I've come to discuss your situation with Charles Morton." They invited him in, and over coffee, Beck laid out his position. "Morton has been a member of the association for years, but his recent behavior has troubled many of us. Your letter, ma'am, along with the Inspector Richardson's report about the false complaint, has forced us to reconsider his membership." He paused, then continued, "But more than that, your letter made us think about accessibility in our organization. We have several members who are losing their hearing as they age, and we've done nothing to accommodate them. Would you both consider attending our next meeting? We'd like to learn from your methods." It was a victory of sorts, but Lydia knew the real battle wasn't over. Charles Morton wouldn't give up easily, and indeed, his harassment escalated. Dead animals began appearing on their property line. Someone poisoned the waterhole the cattle used on the eastern pasture, though fortunately Elias noticed the discoloration before any animals drank. Anonymous threatening letters arrived at the ranch, the handwriting disguised, but the sentiment clearly Charles's. The situation came to a head during the Founders' Day celebration in town. It was Willow Creek's biggest annual event, commemorating the establishment of the settlement 20 years earlier. There would be speeches, competitions, dancing, and a community dinner. Elias and Lydia hadn't planned to attend, knowing their presence might cause tension, but Miss Brennan convinced them otherwise. "The children have prepared something special," she said mysteriously. "They've been practicing for weeks. You have to come." So they went, dressed in their best clothes, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that still followed them even after all these months. They found seats near the back of the gathering area where the speeches would be held, hoping to remain inconspicuous. The surprise came after the mayor's opening remarks. Miss Brennan took the stage with her entire class, including the partially deaf Crawford boy. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "the children would like to present something they've learned." What followed was extraordinary. The 22 children began reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, but not just speaking it. They signed every word in perfect unison, their young hands moving with practiced precision. When they finished, they transitioned into a song, "America the Beautiful," still signing while those who could hear sang along. The crowd was stunned into silence for a moment, then erupted in applause. But the children weren't done. Little Sarah Hendricks stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "We learned sign language from Mr. Gray and Mrs. Gray. They taught us that talking isn't just about making sounds. It's about understanding each other. Some of us might lose our hearing when we're old. Some of us might have babies who can't hear. Some of us might get sick like Mrs. Gray did and lose our voices. But now we know we can still talk to each other, no matter what." The simplicity and truth of the child's words seemed to shift something in the crowd. People began nodding, some wiping away tears. The Crawford boy stepped forward and signed something which Miss Brennan translated. "Thank you for showing me I'm not broken." Lydia felt Elias's hand find hers, squeezing tightly. They hadn't expected this public acknowledgement, this validation from the next generation. But the moment was shattered when Charles Morton pushed through the crowd, his face red with drink and rage. "This is disgusting," he shouted. "Teaching our children to act like defectives? What's next? Teaching them to crawl because some people can't walk?" The ugly words hung in the air like a poison cloud. Parents pulled their children closer, some in protection, others in agreement with Charles's sentiment. This was the moment Lydia had dreaded, the public confrontation that would force the town to choose sides. But before anyone could respond, Harrison Beck, the Cattlemen's Association president who had stayed in town after his visit, stood up. His voice carried the authority of years of leadership. "Morton, you're drunk and you're disturbing a family event. More than that, you're showing yourself to be exactly the kind of man we don't want in our association. At our last meeting, we voted to revoke your membership based on your fraudulent complaint against Mr. Gray and your ongoing harassment of his family." Charles wheeled on Beck, stumbling slightly. "You can't do that. I've been a member for—" "You've been a disgrace," Beck interrupted. "Mr. Gray runs one of the most successful operations in the valley despite his deafness. His wife has contributed more to this community in her months here than you have in years. And these children have learned something valuable: how to communicate with all members of our community, not just the ones you deem worthy." Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward. "Charles, I think it's time you went home." But Charles wasn't done. He turned to the crowd, desperate now. "You're all fools if you can't see what they are. Freaks, defectives. Their children will be monsters, mark my words. This town is cursed as long as they—" The slap that silenced him came from an unexpected source, the widow Harrison. The elegant woman stood before him, her hand still raised, her face furious. "How dare you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you speak of children that way, of any children, born or unborn? You are the monster here, Charles Morton. You're a small, petty man who tried to purchase a wife through the mail and then threw a tantrum when she didn't meet your specifications. You've harassed and threatened good people because your pride was wounded. The only defective person here is you, defective in character, in morals, and in basic human decency." The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Charles raised his hand as if to strike back, but Sheriff Hawkins caught his wrist. "That's assault, Charles," in front of about 100 witnesses. "You're under arrest." As the sheriff led Charles away, the man continued to shout obscenities and threats, but his words seemed to lose power with each step, becoming the ravings of a defeated bully rather than any real threat. In the silence that followed, Elias stood up. He couldn't speak to the crowd, but he could sign, and Miss Brennan translated his words. "My wife and I didn't ask to be symbols or examples. We just wanted to live our lives and contribute to this community. But if our presence here helps even one person understand that difference doesn't mean less than, that silence doesn't mean absence of thought, that struggle doesn't mean weakness, then we're glad to be here. Thank you to those who have supported us. To those who haven't, we hope time will change your minds. And to the children who learned our language, you've given us the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that the future will be more understanding than the past. Lydia stood beside him, and together they signed 3 words that needed no translation, their meaning clear in the gesture itself. Thank you all. The celebration resumed after that, though with a different energy. People approached Elias and Lydia throughout the day, some offering support, others asking questions about sign language, still others simply nodding respectfully. The children performed their signed songs several more times at various requests. Each performance met with increasing enthusiasm. As the sun set and the dancing began, Lydia and Elias found themselves at the center of something they hadn't expected: acceptance. Not from everyone, certainly, but from enough people to matter. The banker's wife asked Lydia to teach a sign language class for ladies who wanted to learn. The school board president approached Elias about creating a program for any deaf children who might come to the area. Dr. Sullivan mentioned that he had ordered books on deaf education and medical treatments that might help those with partial hearing loss. Charles Morton's arrest and subsequent trial became a turning point for Willow Creek. He was convicted of destruction of property, harassment, and attempted assault. The judge, who had come from Helena specifically for the case, sentenced him to 6 months in prison and ordered him to pay substantial damages to Elias and Lydia. More importantly, he was forbidden from coming within a mile of their ranch upon his release. This territory is trying to become a state, the judge said during sentencing. We cannot do so if we allow citizens to be terrorized because of their physical differences. Mr. and Mrs. Gray have shown that deaf individuals can be productive, valuable members of society. Mr. Morton has shown that prejudice and hatred contribute nothing but discord. The news of the trial and its outcome spread beyond Willow Creek. Letters began arriving at the ranch from deaf individuals and their families across the territory and beyond. Some shared their own stories of discrimination and triumph. Others asked for advice on everything from running a ranch while deaf to maintaining a marriage between a deaf and hearing partner. One letter particularly moved them. It was from a young deaf woman in Virginia who had been told she could never marry, never have a normal life. She had read about them in the Institute's newsletter and wanted to know if it was really possible to find love and acceptance. Lydia spent days crafting a response, with Elias adding his own thoughts. They told her it wasn't easy, that there would be those who would never understand or accept. But they also told her about the children learning sign language, about the community that had ultimately stood by them, about the quiet mornings on the ranch when the sunrise needed no words to be beautiful. 6 months after Charles Morton's imprisonment, autumn arrived in the valley with a spectacular display of gold and crimson. The aspens on the mountainsides trembled like flames in the wind, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of coming winter. Lydia stood on the porch of the ranch house, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, watching Elias work with a new horse in the corral. She had discovered her pregnancy only a week ago, confirmed by Dr. Sullivan just yesterday, and she hadn't yet found the right moment to tell her husband. The horse Elias was training was a wild Mustang they'd found injured near the eastern boundary of their property. Most ranchers would have put the animal down, but Elias had seen something in its eyes, a wildness that matched his own silent world, perhaps. He'd spent weeks nursing it back to health, and now he was teaching it to respond to visual cues rather than vocal commands. Lydia watched as he moved with infinite patience, his hands creating a language the horse was beginning to understand. The sound of an approaching wagon drew her attention. Emma was driving, with an unfamiliar woman beside her. As they drew closer, Lydia could see the stranger was young, perhaps 20, with auburn hair and a face marked by both determination and uncertainty. Emma helped the woman down from the wagon, and as they approached the porch, she began signing while speaking. Lydia, this is Miss Catherine Wells. She's come from Denver specifically to meet you and Elias. Catherine Wells stepped forward, and to Lydia's surprise, signed fluently, Mrs. Gray, I'm honored to meet you. I'm deaf, have been since birth. I read about you and your husband in the Institute's newsletter. I've come to ask for your help. Lydia immediately signed back, her movement still occasionally hesitant but clear. Please, come inside. How can we help you? As they settled in the kitchen with tea, Catherine's story unfolded through rapid emotional signing that Emma translated for the parts Lydia missed. Catherine was the daughter of a wealthy Denver merchant who had hidden her away for most of her life, ashamed of having a deaf child. She had been educated by private tutors who taught her to read and write, but her father had recently decided it was time for her to marry, specifically to marry a business associate's son who saw her deafness as assurance that she would be a quiet, compliant wife. "I ran away," Catherine signed, her hands trembling slightly. "I took what money I could and left. But I don't know how to live in the world. I've barely been outside my father's house. When I read about you both, about how you've built a life here despite everything, I thought perhaps you could teach me." Lydia and Emma exchanged glances. Taking in a runaway was serious business, potentially illegal if her father pursued the matter. But looking at Catherine's desperate face, Lydia knew what Elias would say even before she consulted him. When Elias came in from his work with the Mustang, dusty and tired, his expression shifted from surprise to understanding as Catherine's situation was explained. He signed directly to the young woman. "You're welcome here. We'll teach you what we know about making your own way." That evening, as they prepared the spare room for Catherine, Lydia finally found her moment. She took Elias's hand and placed it on her stomach, then signed slowly, "Our child grows here." The transformation of his face, from confusion to understanding to pure, unbridled joy, was something she would remember forever. He pulled her into his arms, his body shaking with silent sobs of happiness. When he finally pulled back to sign, his hands could barely form the words properly. "A baby? Our baby? When?" "Spring," she signed back. "Dr. Sullivan says April or May." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, before dropping to his knees and pressing his face against her stomach, his hands spread wide as if he could somehow feel the tiny life within. When he looked up, he signed, "Boy or girl, deaf or hearing, they will be perfect." Catherine's presence at the ranch brought unexpected challenges and rewards. She had led such a sheltered life that even basic ranch tasks were foreign to her, but she was eager to learn, desperate to prove she could be more than the ornament her father had tried to make her. Elias taught her to ride, to tend animals, to read the weather and the clouds and wind. Lydia taught her to cook, to sew, to manage a household with efficiency and grace. But perhaps more importantly, they taught her to be proud rather than ashamed of her deafness. Catherine had spent 20 years being told she was broken, defective, a family shame to be hidden. Watching Elias run his successful ranch, seeing the respect he commanded from his workers and increasingly from the town, showed her a different possibility. 2 weeks after Catherine's arrival, trouble appeared in the form of a Pinkerton detective hired by her father. The man, Mr. James Porter, arrived in Willow Creek asking questions about a young deaf woman who might have passed through. Sheriff Hawkins, still grateful to Elias and Lydia for their role in exposing Charles Morton's crimes, immediately rode out to warn them. "He's at the hotel now," the sheriff explained through Emma, who had accompanied him. "He'll probably be here tomorrow. Miss Wells is of age, so she can't be forced to return, but her father could make things difficult for you both if he claims you kidnapped or coerced her." That night, they prepared Catherine for the confrontation that was sure to come. Lydia wrote out her legal rights while Elias taught her signs for firmness and refusal. Catherine was terrified but determined. "I won't go back," she signed repeatedly. "I'd rather die than go back to that prison." The detective arrived the next morning, a thin man with sharp eyes and an officious manner. He presented his credentials and stated his business: to locate Miss Catherine Wells and return her to her concerned father. Catherine stepped onto the porch to face him, with Elias and Lydia flanking her protectively. She had prepared a written statement, which she handed to the detective with steady hands. "I am Catherine Wells. I am 20 years old and of sound mind. I left my father's house of my own free will because he intended to force me into a marriage I did not want. I am not being held here against my will. Mr. and Mrs. Gray have offered me employment and shelter, which I have accepted. I will not return to Denver." The detective read the statement, then looked at Catherine with calculating eyes. "Miss Wells, your father is concerned about you. He says your condition makes you vulnerable to exploitation. How do I know these people haven't manipulated you?" Catherine's hands flew in angry signs, which Lydia translated in writing. "My condition is deafness, not stupidity. I can think, reason, and make decisions as well as any hearing person. The only exploitation I've experienced was from my father, who kept me prisoner for 20 years because he was ashamed of me. The detective persisted. Your father is prepared to offer a substantial reward for your return. This time it was Elias who responded, his signs translated by Emma, who had arrived to witness the confrontation. We don't want money. We want Miss Wells to be free to choose her own life, as every person should be able to do. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but then something unexpected happened. The Crawford boy from the school, the partially deaf one, came racing up on his pony, signing frantically. Emma translated his urgent message. Fire at the Hendricks place. They need help. Without hesitation, Elias leaped onto his horse and galloped toward town, followed by his ranch hands. The detective watched in amazement as the supposedly defective deaf man organized a firefighting response as efficiently as any hearing person could. Lydia turned to the detective. She wrote quickly, This is what deaf people can do when given the chance. Go back to Denver. Tell Mr. Wells his daughter is safe, employed, and building a life of her own. If he truly loves her, he'll let her be free. The detective stayed in town 3 more days, observing, asking questions. He saw Catherine helping at the school, teaching sign language to eager children. He saw her working at Emma's shop, her nimble fingers creating beautiful embroidery. He saw her laughing at dinner with Elias and Lydia, more animated and alive than she had ever been in her father's mansion. On his last day, he came to the ranch one more time. I'll tell your father you're safe, he said to Catherine. I'll also tell him that forcing you to return would be cruel. You're clearly thriving here. He paused, then added, My own daughter was born with a club foot. Doctors said she'd never walk properly. My wife and I refused to accept that. We found specialists, tried treatments, and now she dances at society balls. But watching you here, Miss Wells, I realized we were trying to fix her for our comfort, not hers. You're not broken. You're just different. There's no shame in that. After the detective left, Catherine wept with relief. She signed to Lydia and Elias, You've given me more than shelter. You've given me dignity. As autumn deepened toward winter, Lydia's pregnancy began to show. The women of Willow Creek, even those who had initially been skeptical of her, rallied around with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and remedies for morning sickness. Mrs. Patterson, who had once whispered cruel things at the train station, now brought weekly baskets of eggs and preserves, saying, A mother needs proper nutrition. The transformation in the town's attitude wasn't complete. There were still those who crossed the street to avoid them, who whispered about bad blood and divine punishment, but the majority had shifted toward acceptance, even embrace. One snowy November evening, Miss Brennan arrived at the ranch with an unusual request. The Territorial Education Board is meeting next month in Helena, she explained. They're discussing whether to establish a school for the deaf. I've been asked to present, and I'd like you all to come with me, you, Elias, and Catherine. Your presence would speak louder than any words I could say. The trip to Helena was arduous, especially for Lydia in her condition, but they made it. The capital was larger and more sophisticated than Willow Creek, with paved streets and electric lights in some buildings. The Education Board meeting was held in an imposing government building, with board members seated behind an elevated bench like judges. Miss Brennan presented her case eloquently, discussing the success of her integrated teaching approach, the benefit to all students of learning sign language, and the potential for deaf students if given proper education. Then she introduced Elias, Lydia, and Catherine. Through a professional interpreter the board had provided, Elias spoke about his education at the deaf school back east, how it had given him the tools to build a successful life. Catherine discussed the isolation of being hidden away versus the joy of being part of a community. And Lydia, writing her words for the interpreter to read, talked about the bridge that could be built between the deaf and hearing worlds through understanding and education. One board member, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, asked pointed questions. Mr. Gray, how can you ensure the safety of your ranch hands if you cannot hear warnings of danger? Elias signed his response calmly. I've developed visual warning systems. My workers know to use flags, mirrors, and gestures. In 8 years, I've had fewer accidents than most hearing ranchers because my systems require deliberate, clear communication, not shouted warnings that might be misheard or ignored. Another member asked Catherine, Miss Wells, do you not resent your parents for your condition? Catherine's response was fierce. My deafness is not my parents' fault. It simply is. What I resent is being hidden, being treated as shameful. A deaf school would ensure other children don't suffer that isolation. The questioning went on for hours, some sympathetic, others clearly skeptical. Finally, the board chair called for a recess, saying they would render their decision the following day. That evening, in their Helena hotel room, Lydia felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter like a butterfly's wing. She grabbed Elias's hand and pressed it to her stomach, and though he couldn't feel the tiny movement yet, the intimacy of the moment, the promise of their growing family, made both of them cry. The next day, the board announced their decision. They would approve funding for a territorial school for the deaf to be built in Helena, with satellite programs in smaller towns. Miss Brennan was appointed to the planning committee, and both Elias and Catherine were asked to serve as advisors. The ride home was celebratory, but also sobering. They had won a significant victory, but it also meant more responsibility, more visibility. As they approached Willow Creek, they could see lanterns lining Main Street. The town had prepared a welcome home celebration. The crowd that gathered at the schoolhouse that evening was larger than expected. The news of the deaf school approval had preceded them, and people wanted to hear about it. But more than that, Lydia realized, the town had begun to take pride in them, to see them as their deaf family who had brought recognition to Willow Creek. Sheriff Hawkins stood to speak. When Elias Gray first came to this valley 8 years ago, many of us didn't know what to make of him. When Lydia Bennett arrived and Charles Morton rejected her, we witnessed cruelty masquerading as standards. But these two people have shown us something important, that courage comes in many forms, that communication is more than words, and that a community is strongest when it embraces all its members. Others spoke too, ranchers who had learned from Elias's methods, parents whose children now knew sign language. Emma talking about how Lydia had transformed her shop's reputation for fine, detailed work. Even the widow Harrison stood to say that watching their love story had renewed her faith in marriage after her husband's death. As winter settled over the valley, life at the ranch developed new rhythms. Catherine had begun corresponding with other deaf individuals across the territory, building a network of support and friendship. She had also caught the eye of Robert's nephew, a young man named Thomas, who had started learning sign language with determined enthusiasm. "He sees me," Catherine signed to Lydia one evening, her face glowing. "Not my deafness first, but me." Lydia understood that feeling perfectly. It was how Elias had always looked at her, seeing her quietness not as a deficit, but as part of her complete self. The winter was harsh, with storms that isolated the ranch for days at a time. But these periods of isolation were some of Lydia's happiest. She and Elias would sit by the fire, reading or working on projects, their communication flowing seamlessly between signs, touches, and shared glances. Catherine would often join them, the three of them creating a circle of silent conversation that felt richer than any spoken discourse. It was during one such storm that Lydia began experiencing pains. It was too early. She was only 6 months along, but the cramping was unmistakable. Elias saw her distress immediately and signed frantically, "What's wrong?" "The baby," she signed back, fear making her hand shake. "Something's wrong." They couldn't get to town through the storm, but Elias remembered that Dr. Sullivan had taught him emergency procedures for cattle birthing complications. He made Lydia as comfortable as possible, and Catherine boiled water and gathered clean linens, her own fear carefully controlled. The next hours were the longest of Lydia's life. The pains came in waves, and she was terrified she would lose the baby. Elias never left her side, his hands holding hers, his eyes speaking volumes of love and fear and determination. Then, miraculously, the pains began to ease. The cramping slowed, then stopped. By morning, when the storm had passed enough for them to get to town, the immediate danger seemed to have passed. Dr. Sullivan, after a thorough examination, declared it false labor brought on by stress and the low pressure of the storm. "But," he said seriously, "you need to rest more. No heavy work, no long trips. This baby wants to stay put for now, but you need to help by taking care of yourself." Elias became even more protective after that, if such a thing were possible. He hired additional help for the house, despite Lydia's protests about expense. Catherine took over many of Lydia's usual tasks, grateful for the chance to repay their kindness. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of new life, the ranch prepared for multiple births, not just Lydia's baby, but also dozens of calves and foals. It was the busiest time of year, and despite Dr. Sullivan's orders to rest, Lydia insisted on helping with the documentation and organization. It was during this busy season that Charles Morton returned to Willow Creek. His 6-month sentence had ended, and though he was forbidden from approaching the ranch, his presence cast a shadow over the town. He had lost weight in prison, and his eyes carried a hardness that hadn't been there before. He took up residence in a boarding house at the far end of town and found work at a ranch in the next valley, but everyone knew he was biding his time, planning something. The sheriff kept a close eye on him, but as long as he stayed away from Elias and Lydia's property, there was nothing to be done. The tension in town was palpable. People chose sides more definitively than before, those who felt Charles had been wronged by the deaf conspiracy, as he called it, and those who stood firmly with Elias and Lydia. Emma refused to serve anyone who spoke in Charles's favor. The school board made it clear that he was not welcome at any school events. Then, one April morning, as Lydia was in the garden picking early vegetables for dinner, she felt a different kind of pain, deep, rhythmic, undeniable. The baby was coming. Catherine ran for Elias, who was in the far pasture. By the time he arrived, Lydia was already in active labor. They had planned to be in town for the birth, close to Dr. Sullivan, but nature had other plans. The baby was coming now, ready or not. Elias sent a ranch hand racing for the doctor, but he knew they would have to start without him. He had delivered countless calves and foals, had read every medical text he could find about childbirth. But this was different. This was Lydia. This was their child. Catherine proved invaluable, having helped her mother's midwife during several births before her isolation. She signed instructions to Elias while speaking soothing words that Lydia couldn't hear but could feel in their tone. The labor was long and difficult, the baby seemingly reluctant to leave its safe haven. Dr. Sullivan arrived as the sun was setting, taking over with professional efficiency. But it was Elias's face Lydia focused on, his hands that held hers, his eyes that gave her strength. When she wanted to give up, exhausted and frightened, he signed to her, "You are the strongest person I know. Our child is lucky to have you as a mother." Finally, as the full moon rose over the mountains, their baby was born, a daughter, small but perfect, with a lusty cry that Lydia could feel vibrating through her chest even if she couldn't hear it properly. Dr. Sullivan performed his examinations quickly and efficiently. "She's healthy," he announced. "Good lungs, obviously." As for her hearing, only time will tell, but her responses seem normal. Elias held his daughter for the first time with an expression of wonder that transcended any possible words. He signed to Lydia with one hand while cradling the baby with the other. "She's beautiful. Perfect. Like her mother." They named her Grace, for the grace that had brought them together, the grace they had found in their silent world, and the grace they hoped she would carry into whatever future awaited her. The news of Grace's birth spread through Willow Creek quickly. Despite the late hour, visitors began arriving with gifts and congratulations. Mrs. Patterson brought a quilt she had been secretly working on for months. The widow Harrison arrived with an heirloom christening gown. Even some of Charles Morton's former supporters came, the birth of a baby softening hearts that had been hardened by prejudice. Miss Brennan arrived with the school children the next day. They had prepared a special gift, a book of signs specifically for babies, illustrated with their own drawings. "So she can learn both languages from the start," Timothy explained proudly. As Lydia recovered from the birth, she watched the stream of visitors with amazement. This community that had once rejected her now embraced her child without reservation. Grace was not the monster Charles had predicted, but a symbol of hope and continuity. When Grace was a week old, they received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed woman arrived in an expensive carriage, and it took Lydia a moment to recognize Catherine's mother. Mrs. Wells had traveled from Denver, having received word from the Pinkerton detective about where her daughter was. Catherine went rigid with fear when she saw her mother, but Mrs. Wells's first words, signed awkwardly but clearly, were, "I've come to apologize." The reunion between mother and daughter was emotional and complex. Mrs. Wells admitted that she had allowed her husband's shame to override her maternal instincts, that she had failed Catherine in fundamental ways. She had spent the months since Catherine's departure learning sign language and challenging her husband's attitudes. Your father is still struggling, she admitted to Catherine. But I've told him that if he can't accept you as you are, then he'll lose me as well as you. She stayed for 3 days, getting to know not just her daughter, but the life Catherine had built. She held baby Grace with tears in her eyes, saying, "This is what I missed with Catherine, the joy of just celebrating a child for who they are." When she left, she promised to return and to continue working on Catherine's father. "You've built something beautiful here," she told them all. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As spring turned toward summer, Grace began to show her personality. Alert, curious, responsive to both sound and movement. Dr. Sullivan confirmed that her hearing appeared normal, but Elias and Lydia had already decided to raise her bilingual in English and sign language regardless. "She should be able to talk to everyone," Elias signed. "No one should be a stranger to her because of how they communicate." It was a philosophy that was spreading through Willow Creek. The new term at school included mandatory sign language lessons for all students. Several of the ranchers had adopted Elias's visual signal systems for safety. Emma's shop now had a slate at the counter for written communications, used by hearing customers as often as deaf ones when discussing sensitive alterations. But Charles Morton's presence remained a dark cloud. He had been seen surveying the ranch from the public road, technically not violating the restraining order, but clearly planning something. Sheriff Hawkins increased his patrols, but everyone knew Charles was patient. He would wait for his moment. That moment came during the 4th of July celebration. The entire town had gathered for the festivities, speeches, races, food, and fireworks brought all the way from Helena. Elias and Lydia attended with Grace, who at 3 months old was already charming everyone with her bright eyes and ready smile. Charles appeared at the edge of the celebration, staying just within the legal boundaries but making his presence known. He had been drinking, that was clear, and his eyes held a dangerous gleam. He began speaking loudly to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying across the gathering. "Look at them," he said, pointing at Elias and Lydia, "playing at being normal. But that baby, you mark my words, she's damaged goods just like her parents. Maybe not deaf or mute yet, but it'll show. Bad blood always tells." The crowd began to murmur angrily, but Charles continued, his voice rising. "I offered that woman a normal life, and she chose this freak instead. Now they're contaminating our town, our children, with their defects." He never finished the sentence. Thomas, the young man courting Catherine, had crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and landed a solid punch that sent Charles sprawling in the dirt. "That's enough," Thomas said quietly. "You've poisoned this town with your hate for too long." Charles struggled to his feet, reaching for something in his coat, but Sheriff Hawkins was already there, restraining him. When they searched him, they found a loaded pistol. "That's attempted murder," the sheriff said grimly. "Multiple witnesses saw you reach for a weapon in a crowd. You're going away for a long time, Charles." As they led Charles away, he turned back one last time, his eyes finding Lydia's. She expected to see hate, but instead saw something worse, a broken man who had let prejudice and pride destroy his life. She signed to Elias, "I pity him." "Don't," Elias signed back. "He chose his path. We chose ours." The trial that followed Charles Morton's arrest for carrying a concealed weapon with intent to harm became the final chapter in his long campaign against Elias and Lydia. The territorial judge who presided over the case was the same one who had sentenced him before, and his patience with Charles had clearly worn thin. This time, Charles was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, with the judge stating clearly that any future harassment would result in even harsher consequences. As summer progressed, life at the ranch settled into new rhythms shaped by Grace's presence. The baby was thriving, responding to both sounds and visual cues with equal enthusiasm. Lydia would watch in wonder as Elias signed to their daughter, Grace's tiny eyes tracking his hands with intense concentration. At 4 months old, she was already attempting to mimic simple movements, her chubby fingers trying to form shapes that might someday become words. Catherine's romance with Thomas had deepened into something substantial. He had been visiting the ranch regularly, ostensibly to help with repairs, but really to spend time with Catherine. His sign language had improved dramatically, and he had even started teaching other young men in town, arguing that it was a practical skill for anyone who might work with Elias or do business with the increasing number of deaf individuals drawn to Willow Creek by its reputation for acceptance. One evening in late August, as they all sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Thomas did something that surprised everyone. He stood up, walked to face Catherine, and began signing with careful precision. But these weren't just words, it was poetry, a proposal in sign language that he had been practicing for weeks. "Catherine Wells," he signed, "you have taught me that love needs no sound to be heard, no voice to be understood. You have shown me that strength comes not from what we can do, but from who we choose to be. Will you choose to be my wife as I choose to be your husband, in silence and in joy forever?" Catherine's hands flew to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her response, when she finally gave it, was simple and direct. "Yes, with all my heart, yes." The wedding was planned for autumn, and it became a community project. The entire town seemed invested in making it perfect, as if Catherine and Thomas's union was somehow a validation of all the changes Willow Creek had undergone. Emma designed Catherine's dress, incorporating subtle patterns that, when viewed from the right angle, revealed hands forming signs of love and commitment. Miss Brennan organized the school children to create decorations. The widow Harrison offered her garden for the ceremony. But the most meaningful contribution came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived from Catherine's father in Denver, along with a package. The letter, in his cramped handwriting, was brief. "Catherine, I have been wrong. Your mother has made me see that my pride and fear robbed us both of years we cannot reclaim. I cannot undo the past, but I can try to do better in the future. The enclosed belonged to your grandmother, who was also deaf, though I was too ashamed to tell you. She would want you to have it. May you find the happiness I nearly stole from you. Your father, who is learning to sign, I love you." The package contained a beautiful silver locket with a photograph of a young woman who looked remarkably like Catherine, and a note in different handwriting. "My darling granddaughter, if you are reading this, then perhaps the family has finally learned what I always knew, that being deaf is not a curse, but simply a different way of being in the world. Live fully, love freely, and never let anyone make you feel less than whole. All my love, Grandmother Eleanor." Catherine wept over the letter and locket, years of pain beginning to heal with her father's acknowledgement and the revelation that she wasn't the first deaf person in her family, just the first one they'd been unable to hide. The wedding itself was beautiful in its simplicity and innovation. Thomas had learned to sign his vows perfectly, and Catherine's response was so eloquent that even those who didn't understand sign language could feel the emotion in her movements. Elias served as Thomas's best man while Lydia stood with Catherine, baby Grace in her arms, cooing at the gathering as if offering her own blessing. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued into the evening, Dr. Sullivan approached Elias and Lydia with news from Helena. "The Territorial School for the Deaf has been approved for construction," he said through Emma's translation. "They want to name it the Gray Bennett Institute, in honor of what you've accomplished here." Lydia's hands shook as she signed her response. "We didn't do anything extraordinary. We just lived our lives." "Exactly," Dr. Sullivan replied. "And in doing so, you showed everyone that deaf individuals don't need extraordinary accommodations, just ordinary acceptance." As autumn deepened toward winter, Grace reached important milestones. At 6 months, she was sitting up on her own, babbling in the way of all babies, but also making deliberate hand movements that seemed to be her own invented signs. Elias was convinced she had signed milk deliberately, though Lydia thought it might have been coincidence. Either way, they celebrated it as her first word. The ranch was prospering. The visual systems Elias had developed for safety and communication had been adopted by several other ranches, and he had been asked to consult on designing similar systems for a mining operation in the northern part of the territory. His cattle were fetching premium prices, and his horses were becoming known for their excellent training and calm temperaments. One November day, as the first snow of the season began to fall, an elegant carriage arrived at the ranch. Out stepped a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, accompanied by a younger woman who was signing rapidly to him. They introduced themselves as Professor James Hartwell from Gallaudet College and his interpreter daughter, Mary. "Mr. Gray, Mrs. Gray," the professor signed fluently while Mary voiced for him. "I've come with a proposition." Gallaudet College is establishing a Western program for training teachers of the deaf. We would like to base it here in Montana, specifically in Willow Creek, and we would like you both to be founding instructors. The offer was staggering. It would mean transforming Willow Creek into a center for deaf education in the Western Territories. It would bring students, teachers, and families from across the country. It would change everything. That evening, after the professor and his daughter had returned to town, Elias and Lydia sat by the fire discussing the offer while Grace played on a blanket between them. Catherine and Thomas, now married and living in a cabin on the ranch property, joined them. "It's a big responsibility," Elias signed thoughtfully. "We came here for quiet, for peace. This would bring the world to our doorstep." "But think of the children," Catherine signed. "Children like I was, hidden away in shame. This could mean they wouldn't have to hide." Lydia looked at Grace, who was contentedly gnawing on a wooden toy horse Elias had carved for her. She thought of the young deaf woman in Virginia who had written to them, of all the letters they received from families struggling with deafness and isolation. She thought of the boy she had taught in Philadelphia, whose parents had seen his deafness as a tragedy rather than simply a difference. "We should do it," she signed finally. "Not because we're exceptional, but because we're ordinary. We can show them that deaf people can have ordinary, beautiful lives." The decision made, things moved quickly. Professor Hartwell had already secured funding from several Eastern philanthropists who were interested in progressive education. The territorial government, eager to establish Montana as forward-thinking as it pushed toward statehood, offered land and tax incentives. By Christmas, construction had begun on what would become the Gallaudet College Western Campus. But not everyone in Willow Creek was pleased with the development. A group of residents, led by a newcomer named Wallace Brennan, no relation to Miss Brennan, the schoolteacher, began organizing opposition. They argued that an influx of defectives would lower property values, that the town would become known as a place for unfortunates rather than a thriving Western community. The debate came to a head at a town meeting in January. The meeting hall was packed, with supporters and opponents of the college facing off. Wallace Brennan stood to speak first, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, we must think of our town's future. Do we want Willow Creek to be known as a normal, prosperous community, or as some kind of asylum for the deaf and dumb?" The slur made many in the crowd flinch, but Brennan continued. "These people," he gestured toward where Elias and Lydia sat, "have already brought enough attention to our town. Now they want to flood us with more of their kind. What's next? A blind school? A cripple hospital? Where does it end?" He sat down to scattered applause, mostly from newer residents who didn't know Elias and Lydia's story. Then Miss Brennan, the schoolteacher, stood to respond. "Mr. Brennan asks where it ends," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'll tell you where it ends. It ends with Willow Creek being known throughout the territory, throughout the nation, as a place of innovation and acceptance. It ends with our children growing up bilingual, able to communicate with all people. It ends with us being leaders instead of followers." She paused, then continued. "As for property values, I've done some research. Towns with colleges see property values increase, not decrease. The college will bring educated people, construction jobs, ongoing employment, and students who will need housing, food, and services. This is an economic opportunity, not a burden." Sheriff Hawkins stood next. "I've been in this town for 15 years. I've seen it through droughts, floods, conflicts with native tribes, and economic downturns. But the thing that nearly tore us apart was prejudice. Specifically, Charles Morton's campaign against the Greys. That prejudice is now sitting in territorial prison. Do we really want to follow his example?" The debate continued for hours, with passionate arguments on both sides. Finally, Mayor Patterson, whose wife had become one of Lydia's staunchest supporters, called for a vote. The measure to support the college passed by a significant margin, with Wallace Brennan and his supporters walking out in disgust. As winter turned to spring, construction on the college progressed rapidly. The main building was impressive, 3 stories of brick and stone with large windows to let in natural light, essential for a visual language. Dormitories were being built for students who would come from far away. A house was constructed on the campus for Elias and Lydia, who would serve as the primary instructors and administrators. Grace was walking now, toddling around the ranch with determination that reminded everyone of her mother. She was fully bilingual, sometimes signing while babbling, creating a unique pigeon of sound and movement. Her favorite game was having Elias hide and then finding him by following the vibrations of his footsteps through the floor. Catherine and Thomas announced that they were expecting their first child, due in late summer. The news was met with joy, but also some anxiety. What if the child was deaf? Thomas's family had expressed concerns, but Thomas himself was adamant. If our child is deaf, they'll be bilingual like Grace. They'll have every opportunity, every chance to succeed. In May, just after Grace's first birthday, the first students arrived for the summer preparatory session. There were 12 of them, ranging in age from 16 to 30, all deaf, all planning to become teachers. Some had been educated in Eastern deaf schools. Others had been self-taught or tutored privately. They came from as far as California and Texas, drawn by the promise of learning not just to teach, but to advocate for deaf education in their own communities. Lydia was nervous about her first class. She had been working on her sign language continuously, but she still felt less fluent than she wanted to be. She stood before the 12 students with Grace on her hip, the toddler serving as an unintentional icebreaker as she signed hello to each student with enthusiastic, if imperfect, movements. Through her signs and written words on the board, Lydia began, "I am not deaf. I have a damaged voice from childhood illness. Some of you might wonder why I'm teaching here. The answer is simple. I understand what it means to be unable to communicate in the way the world expects. I understand the frustration, the isolation, and the joy of finally being understood. Together we'll learn not just how to teach, but how to bridge worlds." One student, a young man named Samuel from Texas, signed a question. How do we convince hearing people that deaf children can learn everything hearing children can? Lydia's response came from hard-won experience. We show them, not by arguing or pleading, but by succeeding. Every deaf child who grows up educated, confident, and capable is a living argument against prejudice. Elias's classes focused on practical skills, how to run a classroom with visual cues, how to modify traditional teaching tools for deaf students, how to teach both sign language and written English. But perhaps more importantly, he taught them to be proud. You are not defective versions of hearing people, he signed emphatically during one lesson. You are complete deaf people. There is nothing wrong with being deaf. The only thing wrong is a world that refuses to accommodate difference. As summer progressed, the college took shape around them. More buildings were completed, faculty arrived from the east, and the first full class of 40 students was confirmed for the fall semester. Willow Creek was transforming too. Signs appeared in shop windows advertising sign language spoken here, and several businesses hired deaf employees from among the students. Wallace Brennan and his supporters continued their opposition, but their influence was waning. The economic benefits of the college were already apparent. New boarding houses were being built, restaurants were opening, and the general store had tripled its orders to meet demand. Then in July, something happened that shifted the narrative entirely. A fire broke out in the hotel where several of the deaf students were temporarily housed. It started at night, and the usual method of raising alarm, shouting, and ringing bells was useless for the deaf occupants. But one of Elias's safety systems had been installed, a series of flashing lights connected to pull cords throughout the building. A hearing guest pulled the cord when he smelled smoke, and the flashing lights woke every deaf student. They evacuated quickly and efficiently, using the visual emergency procedures they had been taught. Not only did all the deaf students escape safely, but they then helped evacuate confused hearing guests who were disoriented by the smoke. The next day's newspaper headline read, "Deaf Students Save Lives in Hotel Fire." The article detailed how the visual alarm system and the deaf students' calm response had prevented what could have been a tragedy. Wallace Brennan's opposition crumbled in the face of such clear evidence that deaf individuals were not a burden, but an asset to the community. Catherine's baby was born in August, a healthy boy whom they named Edward. The first tests suggested his hearing was normal, but Catherine and Thomas had already decided to raise him with sign language regardless. He'll have deaf relatives, Catherine signed. He should be able to talk to all of his family. As September arrived and the college prepared for its official opening, dignitaries began arriving from across the territory and beyond. The governor came, as did representatives from Gallaudet College, officials from the Bureau of Indian Affairs interested in deaf education for Native Americans' American children, and journalists from major newspapers. The opening ceremony was held on a perfect September day, with golden aspens framing the mountains and the sky a brilliant blue. The main speech was given by Professor Hartwell, but it was simultaneously signed by Elias, creating a powerful visual of inclusion. Today, Professor Hartwell said and signed, we open not just a college, but a doorway. A doorway to opportunity for deaf individuals across the Western territories. A doorway to understanding for hearing people who have never considered that there are other ways of being in the world. And a doorway to the future, where difference is not feared but celebrated. Then it was Lydia's turn to speak. She had practiced for weeks, and though her voice was still barely a whisper, she spoke while signing, the microphone carrying her words to the assembled crowd. 2.5 years ago, I stood on a train platform in this town, rejected and humiliated because my voice didn't meet someone's expectations. Today, I stand here as a teacher, a wife, a mother, and a voice for those who communicate differently. Willow Creek gave me a second chance, and now Willow Creek is giving that chance to dozens of others. This is not just a college, it is hope made manifest. The crowd erupted in applause, clapping and waving hands in the air, sound and silence celebrating together. Grace, now walking confidently, toddled onto the stage and signed love to the crowd, bringing laughter and more applause. As the ceremony ended and people toured the new facilities, Lydia found herself standing with Elias on a hill overlooking the campus. Below them, students and faculty mingled, their hands flying in animated conversation. Children from the town ran between them, some signing, some speaking, all playing together without regard for who could hear and who couldn't. Did you imagine this? Elias signed to her. When you stepped off that train, could you have imagined this? Lydia shook her head, then signed back. I imagined survival, maybe acceptance. But this is beyond imagination. Our daughter will grow up in a world where being deaf isn't hidden, Elias signed, his eyes on Grace, who was playing with Catherine's baby Edward on a blanket nearby. Where having a damaged voice isn't shameful. We did this. No, Lydia signed back. We just lived our lives honestly. The world did the rest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, more people arrived. Families with deaf children who had traveled for days to see the college, to meet others like them, to find hope. Lydia watched as a young deaf girl, perhaps 7 years old, approached Grace. The two children looked at each other for a moment, then Grace signed friend, and the girl's face lit up with joy. This was the true victory, Lydia realized, not the buildings or the recognition or even the redemption from Charles Morton's cruelty. It was this, children growing up in a world where they could communicate freely, where difference was just another form of normal. The first semester of the college was not without challenges. Some of the Eastern-trained teachers had different philosophies about deaf education, leading to heated debates about whether to focus on sign language or lip reading, whether to integrate with hearing students or maintain separation. Elias and Lydia found themselves mediating, drawing on their unique position as a deaf-hearing couple to bridge divides. One particularly contentious issue arose when a parent arrived demanding that their deaf son not be taught sign language at all, insisting that he focus solely on lip reading and speech therapy to appear normal. The boy, 12-year-old Marcus, was miserable, struggling to keep up with lessons he could barely understand and forbidden from using the signs he was naturally picking up from other students. Lydia met with the parent, Mr. Garrett, privately. She brought Grace with her, now almost 18 months old and cheerfully bilingual. As they talked, Grace played, sometimes babbling in her baby voice, sometimes signing to herself, moving fluidly between both modes of communication. Mr. Garrett, Lydia wrote on her slate, her voice too quiet for the agitated man to hear. Watch my daughter. She can hear and speak, but she also signs. She's not confused or limited by knowing both. She's expanded. But Marcus needs to fit into the hearing world, Mr. Garrett protested. If he relies on signs, he'll never learn to speak properly. Lydia wrote carefully. I cannot speak properly. My voice was damaged when I was 7. For years I believed this made me less than whole. But my husband, who cannot hear at all, taught me that communication is about understanding, not about meeting others' expectations of normalcy. She continued, "Your son is deaf. That is his reality. You can either give him tools to thrive as a deaf person, or you can spend his childhood trying to make him into a poor imitation of a hearing person. Which would you rather have, a confident, educated deaf son, or a struggling, frustrated son who never quite manages to be hearing enough?" Mr. Garrett watched Grace toddle over to another child and sign play before leading them to her toys. The ease of it, the naturalness, seemed to shift something in his perspective. "I just want him to have opportunities," he said quietly. "Then give him language," Lydia wrote. "All the language he can absorb. Sign, writing, lip reading if he can manage it, speech if possible. But don't take away the one form of communication that comes naturally to him. That's not giving him opportunity, it's taking it away." Mr. Garrett eventually relented, and Marcus flourished once allowed to learn sign language alongside other communication methods. He became one of the college's success stories, eventually becoming a teacher himself. Winter arrived early that year, with heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. But the isolation was productive. Elias worked on his drawings, creating a visual dictionary of signs that would eventually be published as one of the first comprehensive sign language guides for the Western Territories. Lydia wrote curriculum, developing methods for teaching reading and writing to deaf children who had never heard the sounds letters were supposed to make. Catherine and Thomas were invaluable during this time, helping manage both the ranch and the college responsibilities. Edward was growing fast, and it was becoming clear that while his hearing was normal, he was naturally inclined toward visual communication, often signing before speaking, even when addressing hearing people. "He's truly bilingual," Catherine signed proudly. "He doesn't see one language as primary and the other as secondary. They're just different tools for different situations." It was during one of these snowy isolations that Lydia realized she was pregnant again. The discovery filled her with both joy and anxiety. Grace's birth had been difficult, and Dr. Sullivan had warned that another pregnancy could be dangerous. But when she told Elias, his joy overshadowed any fear. "Another baby," he signed, his hands reverent. "Another person to love." This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Lydia knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was no longer carrying the weight of proving herself to a hostile world. The college was thriving, the town had largely embraced them, and even Wallace Brennan had quietly left for opportunities elsewhere. The baby, a boy they named Samuel, was born in early summer, just as the college's first year was ending. Several of the students had already secured positions teaching in deaf schools or establishing new programs in their home territories. The success stories were spreading, drawing more students and more support. Samuel was different from Grace from the beginning. Where she had been alert and responsive to everything, he was calmer, more observant. By 3 months old, it was clear that his hearing was limited. He responded to very loud sounds, but not to normal speech, Dr. G. Sullivan confirmed partial deafness, likely to progress to complete deafness as he grew. Some might have seen this as a tragedy, but Elias and Lydia felt only acceptance. Samuel would grow up in a home where deafness was normal, where sign language was as natural as breathing, where his worth would never be questioned because of his hearing. The news of Samuel's deafness spread through town, and the response was telling of how much had changed. Instead of pity or horror, people offered congratulations on the baby's health and beauty. Several hearing parents approached Lydia to ask if their hearing children could attend sign language classes, wanting them to be able to communicate with Samuel and other deaf children as they grew. Miss Brennan incorporated sign language into the regular curriculum at the town school, making Willow Creek one of the first towns in the territory where all children, hearing and deaf, learned both languages as a matter of course. The school board, which had once worried about integrating a single partially deaf child, now proudly advertised their inclusive education program. As the college entered its second year, enrollment doubled. Students came not just from the Western territories, but from Mexico, Canada, and even a few from overseas. The diversity brought new perspectives and challenges, but also richness to the educational experience. One student, a young Native American woman named Mary Crow Feather, brought particular attention to the intersection of deafness and cultural identity. She had been deaf from birth but had been taken from her tribe and placed in a hearing boarding school where both her deafness and her cultural identity were seen as problems to be solved. "They tried to beat the Indian out of me and force the hearing into me," she signed during one particularly emotional class discussion. "They failed at both, but they nearly succeeded in beating the person out of me entirely." Her presence at the college sparked important conversations about how deaf education needed to respect and incorporate students' cultural backgrounds, not erase them. Elias and Lydia worked with her to develop a curriculum that honored both deaf culture and tribal traditions, creating a model that would later be adopted by schools across the country. As Grace approached her third birthday and Samuel his first, the family dynamic had settled into something beautifully complex. Grace was protective of her partially deaf brother, often serving as his interpreter, even though he was beginning to sign quite well himself. She moved fluidly between spoken English with hearing visitors and sign language with deaf ones, sometimes switching mid-sentence if she realized someone wasn't understanding. One evening, as the family sat together in their on-campus house, a visitor arrived. Margaret, Lydia's cousin from Boston. She had come for the college's second anniversary celebration, but also to see the life Lydia had built. "I hardly recognize you," Margaret said, watching Lydia simultaneously sign a story to the children while Thomas translated it into spoken words for practice. "You're so animated, so confident." Lydia set down Samuel, who toddled over to Elias and wrote on her slate for Margaret, "I'm the same person. I just finally found a world that speaks my language." Margaret stayed for 2 weeks, and during that time she learned basic sign language and helped in the college office. Before she left, she made a surprising announcement. She was establishing a scholarship fund for deaf students from the eastern states to attend the college. "You've built something important here," she told Lydia, "something that needs to be supported and replicated." The second anniversary celebration of the college was even larger than the opening ceremony. The governor returned, this time bringing several legislators who were working on Montana's bid for statehood. They were particularly interested in the college as an example of Montana's progressive attitudes and innovative approaches to education. During the celebration, testimonials were shared from graduates who were now teaching across the territory. One young man had established a deaf education program on a Sioux reservation. A young woman had opened a school for deaf children in Denver, with Catherine's parents among the primary supporters. Another graduate had become the first deaf person admitted to the Montana bar, specializing in disability rights law. But perhaps the most moving moment came when a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd, Charles Morton. He was older, grayer, clearly broken by his years in prison. He didn't approach the stage or try to enter the celebration, but stood at a distance, watching. Lydia saw him first and touched Elias's arm, directing his attention. They could have had him removed. He was violating the restraining order by being so close. But something in his posture, the defeat in it, made them pause. Sheriff Hawkins noticed him too and started to approach, but Lydia stopped him with a gesture. She walked to where Charles stood, Elias beside her, ready to protect if needed. But Charles made no threatening moves. Instead, he pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to Lydia with shaking hands. It was a letter, written in careful script. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I have no right to anything from you, but I needed you to know I was wrong about everything. Prison gave me time to think, to see what my pride and prejudice cost me. I see what you've built here, what you've become, and I realize that I was the defective one all along. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand. You were never damaged goods. I was." He turned to leave, but Lydia touched his arm, stopping him. She wrote quickly on her slate, "Understanding is the first step toward healing. I hope you find peace." Charles's eyes filled with tears. He nodded once, then walked away, disappearing into the crowd and, as it turned out, from Willow Creek forever. They later learned he had moved to California, where he lived quietly until his death several years later. The encounter with Charles, rather than darkening the celebration, seemed to underscore how far they had all come. The man who had once embodied the town's prejudice had been transformed by witnessing what acceptance could build. As the evening progressed, Elias stood to make an announcement. Through Professor Hartwell's translation, he shared news that would shape the college's future. We have received word that when Montana achieves statehood, which seems likely within the year, the Gallaudet College Western Campus will become the Montana State College for the Deaf, with permanent state funding and an expanded mandate to serve not just Montana, but the entire northwestern region. The crowd erupted in celebration. This meant stability, growth, and most importantly, permanence. The college wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was an institution that would outlive them all. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Lydia found herself standing where she had stood years before, at the train platform. But this time, she wasn't alone and ashamed. She was surrounded by family, friends, and a community that had learned to speak her language in more ways than one. Grace tugged at her skirt, signing, "Mama, why are we here?" Lydia knelt down to her daughter's level and signed back, "This is where our story began." Where I learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things. "Like what?" Grace signed, her 3-year-old curiosity insatiable. "Like your father. Like you and Samuel. Like this whole beautiful life we've built." Elias joined them, Samuel in his arms, the boy's hands moving in baby signs that weren't quite words yet, but would be soon. Catherine and Thomas approached with Edward, who immediately ran to Grace, the two cousins beginning an animated conversation that switched between speaking and signing with the fluid bilingualism of their generation.